The Romans didn't eat dinner, they performed it. To the average Roman elite, a meal wasn't just a chance to fill your belly. It was a golden opportunity to remind everyone how obscenely wealthy, well-connected, and thoroughly extra you were. The modern equivalent would be throwing a dinner party where the food is served on hoverboards, the napkins are made of cashmere, and the appetizers whisper compliments to the guests. Except in Rome, this wasn't a one-time event. This was Tuesday. Dear listeners, histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why dinner in ancient Rome was one big regret, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the word convivium, which was the Roman term for a formal dinner party. It literally translates to living together, but don't let that cozy-sounding name fool you. These events were less about bonding and more about bragging rights. Think of it as Instagram, but with more wine and fewer filters. And if you weren't reclining in silk robes while being fed exotic fruit by a human servant, were you even trying? A proper Roman feast began with status, who you were, who you knew, and who you could afford to offend by not inviting. Guests were arranged not alphabetically or by zodiac sign, but by a rigid social hierarchy. The best spots weren't at the head of the table, there was no table. Instead, elite Romans dined on triclinium couches, reclining on their left sides like glorified throw pillows, while slaves brought them courses. Reclining while eating was the privilege of freeborn citizens, especially males. Women could join in, if they had the right connections. Everyone else? Enjoy your bowl of barley in the hallway, peasant. And while the idea of lounging as you eat might sound luxurious, in practice it turned dinner into a weird mix of yoga and indigestion. Imagine trying to eat roasted duck while balancing on one elbow, maintaining eye contact with your host, and avoiding dropping figs on your toga. One wrong move and suddenly you're choking on peacock liver in front of a senator. But food was just the bait. The real purpose of the convivium was spectacle. Everything was designed to make the host look powerful. The size of the feast, the exoticness of the dishes, the number of courses, sometimes dozens, the gold-plated dinnerware, all of it screamed, "I am richer than Jupiter and twice as petty." Servants flitted about the room like anxious butterflies, refilling cups, offering scented cloths, and fanning guests with palm leaves mid-bite. Yes, literal fanning during chewing, because heaven forbid a light breeze be unavailable while you nibble on imported figs from Carthage. And if you were lucky or unlucky, depending on how you felt about uninvited wildlife, some hosts would even bring in live animals as entertainment. Exotic birds, monkeys, and trained dogs performing tricks. One emperor famously released leopards into the dining hall just to watch his guests panic. So appetizers and adrenaline. Then there were the vomitoriums, often misunderstood, contrary to popular myth. A vomitorium wasn't a dedicated room for throwing up between courses. It was actually a passageway in Roman theaters. But that didn't stop some partygoers from taking the idea quite literally. The elite didn't officially purge during meals, but accounts do suggest that vomiting between courses, discreetly of course, was not unheard of, especially at the more unhinged banquets. Because why limit yourself to 3 courses when you could just reset your stomach like a Roman food printer? And this wasn't just harmless gluttony. These dinners could be dangerous. Eating the wrong dish could land you with food poisoning or a poisoned dagger hidden in your goose pate. Some guests even brought their own food tasters, just in case the host had more than just a generous spirit. Even conversation was curated. You couldn't just talk about your dog or the latest chariot crash. Dinner conversations were meant to be cultured. Poetry, politics, philosophy, and gossip. Lots and lots of gossip. The kind that could get you promoted or exiled. And don't even think about leaving early. A dinner invitation was more like a royal summons. Decline at your peril. If you insulted your host by refusing to attend, or worse, by failing to act impressed enough, you could find yourself blacklisted from future gatherings, or depending on the emperor, publicly mocked in a poem and sent to a remote island with no garum. Tragic. In short, the Roman convivium was a high-stakes theatre of excess, equal parts luxury, politics, and gastrointestinal roulette. You weren't there to eat, you were there to impress, be impressed, and maybe survive the evening with your dignity and your digestive system intact. Because in ancient Rome, dinner wasn't just a meal. It was a competitive sport where everyone lost a little dignity. If you've ever looked at a flamingo and thought, "That looks delicious," congratulations, you may have what it takes to dine like a Roman emperor. While modern luxury might involve truffles, wagyu beef, or gold leaf sushi, the Roman elite said, "Hold my fermented fish sauce," and rolled out a banquet where the guest of honor was a bird. Not the whole bird, mind you, just its tongue. Yes, flamingo tongues. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't even a side dish. It was a status symbol you could chew. Ancient Roman aristocrats developed a taste for the bizarre, the rare, and the wildly inconvenient to prepare. Flamingo tongues topped the list of edible extravagance, not because they were particularly flavorful. Sources suggest they were soft, fatty, and kind of gelatinous, but because they were stupidly hard to get. You had to catch flamingos, keep them alive long enough to harvest their teeny tongues, sometimes in bulk, and then cook them without losing face or feathers. This was luxury not for the mouth but for the ego. Why eat something common when you could demand a dish that required a logistical nightmare and possibly a wildlife permit? But flamingos were just the beginning. The Roman elite went full avian apocalypse when crafting their menus. Peacock brains were another delicacy, considered refined and invigorating, though it's unclear whether the invigorating part was from the taste or from the smugness of saying, "Ah yes, we're having brain tonight, but make it bird." Then came parrot heads, served whole, because why not combine culinary opulence with a slight risk of beak-related injury? Ostrich livers made the list too. Yes, ostriches, those massive birds that can kick lions, were hunted, slaughtered, and disassembled into livers and drumsticks for Roman feasts. A single ostrich could feed a village. A Roman dinner party used it to impress 10 senators and a guy named Publius with 6 rings per finger. One infamous Roman gourmand, Marcus Gavius Apicius, took this trend to deliciously unhinged levels. Apicius was basically the Gordon Ramsay of ancient Rome. If Gordon Ramsay thought the only acceptable salad dressing was gold dust, he once reportedly spent a small fortune traveling across North Africa to sample the finest shrimp, only to turn back when the seafood wasn't decadent enough. This is the same man who allegedly tried to invent a way to eat flamingo tongues pickled in honey and vinegar. At this point, the birds probably started organizing their own anti-Roman protests. But why? Why this obsession with feathered body parts that most modern menus would classify as "please do not eat"? The answer lies in a concept Romans took very seriously. Rarity equals status. In a culture obsessed with hierarchy, what you ate and how absurd it was to get became the ultimate social flex. Commoners might eat bread and beans, but the wealthy, they wanted meals that required a ship, a hunter, and several bad decisions to acquire. The rarer and more impractical the dish, the higher the prestige. Serving a dish of 50 flamingo tongues was the ancient Roman version of pulling up to a party in a diamond-encrusted chariot powered by pure narcissism. You weren't eating because you were hungry. You were performing dominance through poultry. And it wasn't just about the food itself. It was the ritual around it. These exotic birds weren't chopped up in the kitchen like any old chicken. No, they were presented whole, flamboyantly, with their colorful plumage intact, only missing the bits that were already in your appetizer. Imagine sitting down to a meal where a peacock, feathers and all, is wheeled in on a silver platter like some kind of haute couture turkey. It wasn't dinner. It was ornithological theatre. These dishes also showed off the host's connections. Flamingos weren't native to Rome, neither were parrots. So if you had them on your menu, it meant you had access to trade networks stretching across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Your guest wasn't just eating a bird, they were tasting the farthest reaches of your empire, and hopefully not getting salmonella in the process. Of course, the downside to dining like this was the small matter of digesting it all. Ancient sources don't spend much time describing what these birds actually tasted like, but given the Roman tendency to slather everything in wine, vinegar, and questionable sauces, it's safe to say subtle flavor was not the goal. The tongue of a flamingo, after all, was not created by nature to be appetizing. It was created to filter water through mudflats. But to a Roman aristocrat, that just made it all the more delicious. In a society where food became a way to measure power, the birds didn't stand a chance. Their tongues, brains, and livers weren't ingredients, they were trophies with calories. And if you could afford to sacrifice 100 exotic birds just to serve 3 teaspoons of meat, you were sending a message: I am rich enough to ruin ecosystems for a snack. So yes, if your appetizer required a zookeeper, a cargo ship, and a total disregard for biodiversity, you knew you were dining in Rome. If you've ever looked at a mouse and thought, this would be better if it were filled with pork and honey, congratulations, you might have been a top-tier Roman chef, or possibly cursed by the gods. Either way, welcome to the truly unhinged world of Roman fine dining, where flavor wasn't just rich, it was aggressively confusing. Forget moderation. The Romans had the taste buds of a dessert-deprived toddler and the budget of a modern oil tycoon. Their dream dish? Something that was fatty, sweet, salty, crunchy, and possibly illegal in 3 provinces all at once. And nothing captured that chaos quite like the humble, horrifying gleeries, also known as the edible dormouse. Now, before you imagine a sad, squashed rat on a plate, dormice were a particular species. Smaller, cuter, and specifically bred to be eaten. These weren't street mice scooped off the Colosseum floor. These little creatures were raised in specialized jars called gleraria, essentially ancient rodent Airbnbs. These ceramic jars were designed to fatten up the mice in total darkness, feeding them acorns, walnuts, and chestnuts until they hit peak plumpness. Imagine a Roman petting zoo where everything was on the menu. And what did they do with these adorable butterballs of doom? They stuffed them, like a plush toy with anger issues. A typical recipe, yes, this was written down, called for minced pork, pepper, nuts, spices, and a glaze of honey, all crammed inside the dormouse's body. Then it was roasted or boiled, depending on how deeply you wanted to insult culinary boundaries. It was sweet, it was savory, it was rodent-shaped, and for the elite, it was heaven on a plate. But dormice weren't the only dish to get the Roman food Frankenstein treatment. The entire banquet was an ever-escalating flavor war. You didn't serve plain meat, you smothered it in sauces made from wine, honey, vinegar, and fermented fish goo. You didn't serve bread, you had cheesecake baked with bay leaves or puffed pastries dipped in honey and poppy seeds. You didn't just eat, you committed to flavor like it owed you money. And guests didn't nibble politely, they gorged. Roman banquets were structured to encourage excess. You started with gustatio, appetizers, followed by prima mensa, the main course, and ended with secunda mensa, dessert. Each round was meant to outdo the last. By the time the almond-stuffed songbirds hit the table, your belt was crying for help, but no one stopped eating just because they were full. Oh no. That was for peasants and philosophers. Real guests kept going, sometimes to the point of vomiting, just to make room for more. Yes, that's right. Voluntary purging wasn't considered gross. It was practically practical. If your host brought out caramelized snails dusted with gold and you were already at capacity, no problem. Excuse yourself, reset your internal organs, and return for round 4. And remember to compliment the cook. Manners still mattered, even if your stomach lining didn't. Now, not everyone loved this gluttonous parade of tiny, overfilled creatures. Philosophers like Seneca and Cato the Elder were horrified. They considered these banquets a symptom of Rome's moral decay, a literal feeding frenzy of arrogance and soft cheese. Seneca once lamented that the elite cared more about stuffed dormice and monkey meat than about virtue, which, to be fair, is a sentence that really writes itself. Still, stuffed dormice became the gold standard of Roman appetizers, frequently served at high-status gatherings, and featured in Rome's earliest surviving cookbook, Apicius. And while the modern stomach might recoil at the idea of sugar-glazed rodents, the ancient Roman palate was trained to appreciate culinary shock value. If your first course didn't confuse your brain and cholesterol levels, were you even trying? This obsession with rich, complicated food wasn't just about flavor, it was about conquest. Rome conquered territories, and their tables reflected it. Spices from the east, nuts from North Africa, pigs from Gaul, and dormice from someone's unfortunate back garden. Each dish was a digestible trophy, a declaration of Rome's dominance over taste, trade, and common sense. Even the portions were excessive. These weren't tapas-sized servings. Romans were known to serve entire pigs stuffed with sausages, or boiled cows with ducks crammed inside like some kind of ancient meat turducken. And if a mouse could be turned into a delicacy, then nothing was off limits. Everything was game, literally and metaphorically. So when you hear that the Romans loved sweet and savory combos, don't think pineapple on pizza. Think honeyed organ meat wrapped in dormouse bacon, served on a silver platter shaped like a swan. Because in ancient Rome, when your starter is a mouse filled like a piñata, you know you're in trouble. There are some culinary mysteries that remain lost to time. And then there's garum, a mystery only in the sense that we're still wondering how anyone could sniff it and not run in the opposite direction. Yet in ancient Rome, garum wasn't just popular, it was a national obsession. This pungent fish sauce was the ketchup, soy sauce, ranch dressing, and emotional support condiment of the ancient world. But unlike ketchup, which is made with tomatoes and joy, garum was made with fish guts, sun exposure, and the slow decay of your faith in humanity. Let's start with how it was made. You take small fish, usually anchovies or mackerel, and mash them up whole, guts and all. Then you add a generous heap of salt, stir it around until it resembles something between wet gravel and gilt, and leave it out in the hot Mediterranean sun for months. Not days, not weeks, months. As it ferments, the fish liquefies into a murky brown fluid, which is then strained to separate the precious sauce from the rest of the fish situation. Congratulations, you now have garum. It smelled exactly the way you'd expect a sauce made of rotting fish left out in 90-degree heat to smell. Pliny the Elder, that most patient of ancient naturalists, described the smell as delicate, which is proof that either ancient noses were built different or Pliny lost a bet. Others were more honest. It reeked. Think low tide mixed with armpit and a touch of despair. A Roman kitchen preparing garum wasn't so much cooking dinner as it was summoning Poseidon through aromatherapy, and yet they loved it. Romans poured garum on everything: meats, vegetables, fruits, cheeses, desserts. If it could be chewed, it could be garumed. They added it to wine, they added it to honey. They probably would have added it to their tax documents if it had any bureaucratic function. It wasn't just a flavor enhancer, it was a lifestyle choice. In fact, there were many types of garum, each with different grades and price points. The highest quality was called garum sociorum, a luxury version that only the rich could afford. It was smoother, more refined, and probably slightly less haunted. The lower quality sludge at the bottom of the barrel was liquamen, which was either sold to the poor or used to peel paint from walls depending on the consistency. But garum wasn't just something you slathered on your stuffed dormouse or parrot wings, it was big business. Entire towns along the Mediterranean were dedicated to garum production. In places like Pompeii, garum factories, complete with fermentation vats and drainage systems, were as common as bathhouses and temples. If your city smelled like a seafood apocalypse, congratulations, the local economy was booming. These factories were not charming artisanal shops, they were open-air rot farms. Workers would stir the fish mixture under the blazing sun, surrounded by vats of bubbling decay. The stench could travel for miles. It is strongly suspected that this is the real reason ancient Romans invented scented oils to mask the scent of fish Armageddon wafting through their marble courtyards. The economic reach of garum was vast. It was exported throughout the Roman Empire, from Gaul to Judea, from Britannia to North Africa. Amphorae filled with garum were shipped across seas and deserts. Archaeologists have even found garum jars with labels. Imagine that, product of Hispania, aged to perfection. Slightly less horrifying, some jars were even branded with the maker's name, a kind of ancient marketing pitch. So if your garum didn't make you weep from the nose, it probably came from a lesser vendor. But let's pause for a moment and ask why. Why would a culture so obsessed with decadence, luxury, and bathing voluntarily eat something that could knock over a goat at 10 paces? The answer lies in umami, the savory fifth taste. Garum was packed with glutamates, the same chemical compounds that make soy sauce and Parmesan cheese addictive. It added depth and richness to food, making even bland barley stew taste like it came from a divine kitchen staffed by Neptune's personal chefs. In a time before refrigeration and modern seasoning, garum made everything taste better, or at least stronger. It was the MSG of antiquity, except instead of being isolated in a lab, it was brewed in a cauldron of fish nightmares. Even the military got in on the action. Roman soldiers carried portable jars of garum with them while marching, because when you're battling barbarians in Germania, what you really want after a long day is some fermented fish drizzle on your barley cake. There were even medicinal uses. Roman physicians recommended garum for digestive problems, wounds, dog bites, ulcers, and scorpion stings, which either means garum had actual health benefits, or the smell was so bad that your other symptoms just gave up and left. So yes, garum was revoltingly popular, and absolutely essential to Roman cooking. It unified their cuisine the way tomato sauce does for Italian food. Except tomato sauce doesn't smell like Poseidon's garbage disposal. In modern terms, imagine ketchup. Now imagine it's made of regret and anchovy ghosts. Dessert. The word alone sparks joy. It's the reward at the end of a long meal. A sugary high five for surviving salad, meat, and your aunt's aggressively seasoned potatoes. But in ancient Rome, dessert wasn't about comfort. It was about culinary surprise attacks, flavor curveballs, and the deeply questionable belief that nothing says sweet treat like a hint of vinegar and a splash of fermented fish. Yes, dear listener, Romans ruined dessert regularly, on purpose. Let's set the stage. You've just survived a Roman feast filled with flamingo tongues, honey-glazed rodents, and 5 types of animal livers. You're reclining sideways, bloated, possibly regretting several life choices. And then dessert arrives. Except instead of a slice of pie or a scoop of sorbet, the final course is a bean paste sweetened with honey, or maybe some boiled pears topped with garum. Yes, the fish sauce. Or, if your host is feeling fancy, cheesecake layered with herbs and black pepper. To the modern palate, Roman dessert was less and more wait what. They had the ingredients to make delicious treats, honey, nuts, fruits, even dairy, but they couldn't help themselves. If it wasn't slightly odd, was it even Roman? Take honeyed dates, one of the few Roman desserts that actually sound delightful. Dates stuffed with almonds or pine nuts, soaked in honey, and sometimes baked. Great, right? But many hosts couldn't resist improving them by adding vinegar, fish sauce, or strong spices, because nothing says end on a high note like your dessert tasting like a tangy seafood mystery. Then there's the Roman version of cheesecake, which could have been a sweet, creamy finish to a heavy meal. Instead, the typical recipe included layers of ricotta-like cheese, bay leaves, and cumin, sometimes sweetened with honey but often leaning more savory than sugary. It was less cheesecake at a cafe, and more, what happens when your cheese course has an identity crisis. Another favorite, patina de pyrrhus, or pear patina. This dessert featured boiled pears, mashed with pepper, cumin, honey, raisin wine, and licumen, again fish sauce. It was a warm fruit dish that smelled like dessert but tasted like someone spilled a Caesar salad into your applesauce. Why this obsession with mixing the sweet and the salty, the fruity and the fermented, the yum and the you sure about that? It all goes back to the Roman approach to flavor. Contrast was king. Romans loved playing with combinations that shocked the tongue. They didn't want a dessert that gently lulled you into a sugar coma. They wanted a final course that slapped you across the face, yelled surprise, and then made you question whether you were eating pudding or a prank. And this wasn't limited to the elites. Even among the middle class, desserts were often elaborate mixtures of honey, vinegar, herbs, and spices. Sweets were rare and expensive, so when Romans got their hands on them, they used everything they had at once, like a child making a sandwich out of every item in the fridge. A little honey, great. A little pepper, why not? A splash of wine, a pinch of coriander, a squirt of vinegar, and just a whiff of rotting fish sauce. Perfect. It's dessert, baby. There was also a philosophical angle to this flavor chaos. Roman cuisine wasn't just about feeding the body, it was about testing the senses. Food was theater, art, and sometimes warfare, and dessert was no exception. For the wealthy especially, dessert was one more opportunity to flex their creativity, wealth, and total disregard for conventional taste. It wasn't just about what you served, it was about how weird, rare, and shockingly expensive it was. Some Roman cookbooks even included recipes for desserts shaped like animals or mythical creatures, made of flour paste and honey, stuffed with nuts and, possibly, regret. These weren't just treats, they were edible sculptures. Sometimes guests weren't sure whether to eat them or applaud. And don't forget the libum, a type of sacrificial sweet bread made with cheese and honey, originally intended for the gods, but often served at the table anyway. What better way to end a meal than by nibbling on leftovers meant for Jupiter? Even drinks served with dessert were confusing. Instead of dessert wines or cordials, Romans sometimes finished with hot spiced wine, thick with herbs, or cold vinegar-based drinks like posca, which was technically for soldiers and the lower class but somehow found its way into the elite rotation because Romans just couldn't stop experimenting. Because when your dinner ended with both cheesecake and vinegar, clearly restraint was off the menu. In the end, dessert in ancient Rome wasn't sweet relief, it was a final flavor flex, a bewildering culinary encore to a dinner already packed with birds, rodents, and fermented fish. Because in Rome, dessert wasn't the treat at the end, it was just another chance to get weird with your taste buds. In ancient Rome, the line between drinking for pleasure and drinking because the water might unalive you was very, very blurry, mostly because that line was floating in a jug of questionable wine. To understand Roman drinking habits, you first need to understand this. Water was not to be trusted. Sure, aqueducts were a marvel of engineering, and Roman baths were architectural masterpieces, but drinking straight-up water, that was for the desperate and the doomed. The average Roman saw water as a last resort, something you mixed with wine, bathed in, or used to clean amphorae, but rarely consumed plain. Why? Because it often came with bonus parasites, a hint of sewer runoff, or a suspicious flavor profile best described as urban moss. So instead, Romans drank wine, constantly, endlessly, enthusiastically. It wasn't just for celebrations, it was for breakfast, it was for cooking, it was for wound care, insomnia, childbirth, and apparently, dental hygiene. Wine was the answer to every problem, whether you were dealing with heartbreak or just trying to unalive whatever bacteria had moved into your water jug. But, and here's the twist, Romans didn't drink wine the way we do. For one thing, their wine was absurdly strong, more like a syrupy wine concentrate. Drinking it straight was considered barbaric. So what did they do? They watered it down. Yes, the people who put fish sauce on their pears drew the line at drinking full-strength wine. This wasn't just a personal preference, it was a moral and cultural rule. The ideal mix was around 1 part wine to 2 or 3 parts water. Anything stronger and you were considered uncivilized, unless of course you were at one of those wild, no-holds-barred drinking parties, in which case full-strength wine was not only allowed, it was encouraged, especially if your name was Elagabalus. Ah yes, Emperor Elagabalus, the poster child for Roman excess. Known for his love of orgies, peacock feasts, and purple everything, Elagabalus famously served wine from fountains, filled swimming pools with it, and once hosted a banquet where the guests drowned in rose petals. Drinking wine in moderation? That wasn't on his to-do list. Neither, apparently, was ruling responsibly. But back to the average Roman, the act of drinking wine was surrounded by etiquette, ritual, and just enough peer pressure to get you legally tipsy. Toasts were made not just to health, but to gods, ancestors, the emperor, and pretty much anyone who'd recently shown up to dinner in clean sandals. A host was judged not only by the food, but by the quality of wine and the style of its presentation. Warm or chilled, spiced or herbal, aged in ceramic or oak. Some wines were so thick and syrupy they had to be diluted with hot water to make them pourable. Others were flavored with resin, herbs, or even seawater, because why not add a splash of ocean confusion to your buzz? Sweet wines from regions like Falernum and Sacabon were highly prized, while cheaper brews were used for cooking, bathing wounds, or bribing gatekeepers. Even wine containers had state. Wealthy Romans used crystal goblets or silver cups, while the less fortunate drank from pottery or reused amphorae. But regardless of social class, not drinking wine was considered odd, even suspicious. In fact, if you abstained from wine entirely, people assumed one of three things: you were sick, you were plotting something, you were a philosopher. In which case, still plotting something. On the flip side, drinking too much could be seen as a power move. Being able to hold your wine, or better yet, down an entire amphora, while still reciting Virgil, made you the life of the party, and maybe even senatorial material. Of course, there were limits. Get too sloppy, and suddenly you're the guy face down in a plate of boiled dormouse being mocked in someone's epic poem. But the Romans didn't just drink wine. They medicalized it. Ancient physicians prescribed wine as a remedy for stomach aches, sore throats, melancholy, infections, and broken hearts. It was even recommended for gladiators after a match. Did you just get stabbed by a Thracian in the liver? Try a nice Falernian red. It pairs well with trauma. And for all their elaborate food culture, wine was the great equalizer. Rich or poor, senator or soldier, baker or bard, everyone drank wine. The only difference was how you flavored it, where you bought it, and whether your cup had rhinestones or thumbprints. Perhaps the best evidence of how seriously Romans took their wine comes from the fact that they even had wine gods, not just one, several. Bacchus, Liber, Dionysus, for the Greeks among them, all deities dedicated to the fine art of getting joyfully inebriated and shouting poetry at a moonbeam. Wine wasn't a vice, it was divine protocol. So when you think of Roman dining, imagine not a glass of Pinot Noir, but a murky brew of fermented grapes, seawater, honey, herbs, and maybe a scorpion if the bartender was having a rough day. Hydration? That was for the weak. Real Romans got their fluids from fermented grape chaos, and if you weren't slightly tipsy by the second course, someone was about to ask if you were okay. Let's be clear about something. In ancient Rome, food didn't just threaten your waistline, it threatened your life. Dinner wasn't just a culinary experience, it was a paranoid game of edible Russian roulette, where one wrong oyster could send you to the afterlife. Not because it had gone bad, but because someone made sure it went very, very bad. You see, Romans didn't fear undercooked meat or questionable shellfish nearly as much as they feared other Romans, especially the ones hosting the banquet, because when the Republic turned into the Empire and dinner parties turned into power plays, one thing became increasingly true. You could taste victory, but you might also be tasting poison. And this wasn't some vague, abstract fear, it was institutionalized anxiety. The richer and more politically connected you were, the more likely your meal came with a designated taster slave, a human speed bump between you and certain death by mushroom. Their job was simple: sample every dish and see if they lived long enough to say tastes fine. Needless to say, this was a short-term employment opportunity. These unfortunate food tasters were often young, expendable, and tragically enthusiastic, and because poison sometimes worked slowly, they didn't always drop dead before the actual aristocrat started digging into his dormouse pudding. Still, it was better than nothing. Kind of. Not for the tasters. For them, lunch break was a mortal gamble in 3 courses, and yet, poison was wildly common. It was the assassin's seasoning of choice. particularly when you wanted someone gone without a messy public stabbing. After all, nothing screams subtlety like slipping hemlock into someone's honey-glazed pears and watching them politely thank you before collapsing into their fig compote. Take Claudius, the fourth Roman emperor. According to ancient sources, he died in the most Roman way possible, poisoned at dinner, possibly by a dish of mushrooms. Now, mushrooms in Rome weren't just a food, they were a genre. They could be an aphrodisiac, a delicacy, or a funeral in disguise. Claudius unfortunately got the last version. Who did it? Historians still argue, but all signs point to his ambitious wife Agrippina the Younger, who wanted her son Nero on the throne. So she may have orchestrated the death by fungi, turning dinner into dynastic chess. That's not a power move, that's a power casserole. Speaking of Nero, this guy didn't just survive poisoned meals, he mastered the art of using them. He was said to have employed Locusta, a professional poisoner, whose resume probably included makes a mean stew and a meaner death sentence. Locusta even trained other poisoners and experimented with doses on condemned criminals. She was basically the Gordon Ramsay of assassination. Then there's Emperor Caracalla, who lived in such fear of being poisoned that he'd watch his food being prepared. He allegedly traveled with his own personal chefs, refused any dish he hadn't seen cooked himself, and still, somehow, always looked like someone had licked all the icing off his emotional cupcakes. Because when dinner might unalive you, relaxation is off the table. Even seemingly innocuous ingredients were suspect. Spices could mask strange flavors, sweet sauces could hide bitterness, wine could conceal a dose of powdered death. In fact, the phrase cup of death wasn't poetic, it was a menu warning. Ancient authors like Tacitus and Suetonius wrote about wine goblets laced with toxins, passed by smiling hands with very sharp ambitions, and while many poisons were botanical, hemlock, belladonna, aconite, others were more creative, lead-based powders, mercury-infused balms, and even exotic toxins imported from distant parts of the empire were all fair game. If it could make you stop breathing discreetly by dessert, it was considered a viable option. So how did people cope with this edible anxiety? Besides hiring tasters, they embraced elaborate rituals of trust and theatrics, sharing wine from the same cup, eating from the same dish, or watching someone else swallow first became critical survival strategies. Dinner wasn't just a meal, it was a delicate performance of "I'm not trying to unalive you" wink, and when someone did die mysteriously mid-meal, people didn't assume bad shrimp, they assumed murder. Gossip would erupt instantly. Who stood to gain? Who brought the wine? Who looked smug during dessert? Basically, every Roman dinner had the potential to devolve into an Agatha Christie novel with togas and fewer survivors. This paranoia wasn't confined to the upper crust. Wealthy citizens feared being poisoned by jealous rivals, spurned lovers, or even disgruntled cooks. Recipes were guarded like military secrets, and many hosts would prepare their own meals just to avoid having the chef double as the executioner. Imagine a society where owning a cookbook was as much about self-defense as dinner prep, but the real tragedy? Food was supposed to be sacred. The convivium, the shared feast, was meant to symbolize Roman unity, family, and the gods' blessings. And yet, somewhere between the garum and the goose liver, things went sour. Banquets became battlegrounds, and forks, well, spoons, the Romans hadn't invented forks yet, were wielded with as much suspicion as style. So the next time you sit down to a dinner party and someone asks if you're allergic to mushrooms, spare a thought for ancient Rome, where that wasn't just a dietary question, it was a political one. Because in Rome, dinner parties doubled as murder mystery nights. Except the murder wasn't a twist, it was the appetizer. Let's get something straight. Not everyone in ancient Rome was reclining on silk cushions, nibbling on parrot tongues and sipping wine aged in amphorae, blessed by Bacchus himself. In fact, most Romans couldn't even afford napkins, let alone flamingo, while the upper crust were busy turning dinner into a Cirque du Soleil act of exotic meats and edible peacocking. The average Roman citizen, the plebs, were just trying to survive the day without starving, rioting, or accidentally eating something their neighbor dropped in the gutter. The Roman poor didn't dine, they endured. So what did the plebeians eat? 3 words: carbs, carbs, and more carbs. If it could be boiled into mush or baked into a sad lump, it was on the menu. At the core of the average Roman's diet was a dish called pulse, a humble porridge made from emmer wheat or barley, water, and occasionally despair. Sometimes they'd toss in onions, lentils, or chickpeas if they were lucky, or if their neighbor had just left town and forgotten to lock the pantry. Pulse wasn't exactly exciting. It had the consistency of soggy drywall and the flavor of historical regret, but it filled the stomach. And in a city where stomachs were often empty, that was good enough. Think of it as the Roman version of instant noodles, only without seasoning packets, MSG or Joy. Protein, that was a luxury. Most plebs went days, even weeks, without meat. If they did get any, it was usually salted fish, sausage scraps, or the parts of animals the rich didn't want: red feet, snouts, and mystery organs. Eggs were a treat. Cheese was rare, and if someone showed up with a chicken leg, you were either celebrating or watching the prelude to a mugging. But fear not, the Roman state had a plan: bread and circuses. The government knew that hungry people were angry people, and angry people tend to set things on fire. So to keep the masses somewhat placated, and the Senate unroasted, Rome instituted the annona, the state-sponsored grain dole. Qualified citizens, especially in the city of Rome, received free or subsidized grain to make their daily bread. Literally, this wasn't charity, it was strategic carbohydrate bribery. The idea was simple: keep the urban poor fed enough not to revolt, but not so well fed that they'd start asking for things like healthcare, rights, or flamingo appetizers. Bread became political, the ancient equivalent of both a basic need and a campaign promise. Bakeries were everywhere, many were public or state-run, churning out loaves of dense, coarse bread by the basket load. These weren't flaky French baguettes, these were bricks with yeast. If you dropped one, it could dent a tile floor, but they were affordable, filling, and usually edible, as long as you didn't mind the occasional pebble, ash, or rat whisker baked in. Of course, not all food was eaten at home. Enter the thermopolia, ancient Rome's answer to the food truck, the kebab stall, and the fast food chain all rolled into one. These were small street food counters where the working poor could grab a hot bite on the go, usually stews, lentils, beans, or fried bits of mystery meat. The thermopolia were cheap, noisy, often unsanitary, and completely essential. Think greasy spoons with amphora decor. Because most Roman homes, especially the insulae apartment blocks, didn't have kitchens. These buildings were packed, flammable, and built so quickly and poorly that cooking indoors was a fire hazard and, frankly, a game of culinary roulette. So people turned to the streets to eat. If you were lucky, you got a bowl of bean stew or maybe a hunk of bread dipped in wine vinegar. If you were really lucky, you didn't get food poisoning and your apartment didn't collapse that week. Fruit was seasonal and mostly foraged or bought cheap, figs, apples, and olives being common picks. For a sweet treat, honeyed nuts or dried dates if you could afford them. For the rest, there was gruel. Water, same gamble as always, though cheaper Romans often just diluted their wine with, well, less wine. Hydration was more of a suggestion than a lifestyle. A lukewarm cup of sour wine from a street vendor was a common beverage of choice. If not for flavor, then at least to dull the sensation of chewing another bowl of tasteless porridge. Did the plebs complain? Constantly. Ancient graffiti tells us people were loud about their hunger. Some inscriptions read like Yelp reviews carved into stone. I got no fish today, the bread is dry, and bring back the chickpeas. Riots over grain shortages weren't rare. They were a recurring event. The only thing that kept the city from falling into chaos was the looming promise of the next grain shipment. And yet, despite their meager rations, plebeians made do. They got creative. A chunk of bread with garlic and olive oil? That's almost bruschetta. A bowl of lentils and leeks? That's a vegan meal today. If it weren't for the ash in your soup and the lack of sanitation, you might almost be impressed. In the end, the Roman class divide was nowhere more obvious than at the table. The The rich ate endangered birds, the poor got porridge so bland it came with its own existential crisis. While the wealthy flexed their power with imported spices and edible peacock armor, the rest of the city powered through with chickpeas and civic frustration. Because in ancient Rome, dinner was many things, but for most people, it wasn't a feast. It was a fight to stay full without going broke. If you think modern dinner etiquette is stressful, with all the forks, elbows, and don't talk with your mouth full rules, imagine being invited to a Roman banquet. There were no forks yet, the spoons were slippery, and your reputation hinged on whether you reclined at the right angle while balancing a wine cup, gnawing goosefoot, and pretending not to notice your neighbor using a sponge on a stick. Welcome to Rome, where the table manners were less Emily Post and more chaotic improv with a side of scented oil. Let's start with the basics. Romans didn't sit at the table, they reclined, and not just anywhere. Where you reclined said everything about your social status, political connections, and how much your host liked you. At formal banquets, guests lounged on cushioned couches called lecti arranged in a U-shape, called a triclinium around a central table. The best spots, the high couches, were reserved for the elite. If you were a newcomer, an in-law, or heaven forbid lower class, you got a wobbly cushion near the exit, or worse, a stool. Sitting upright was for women, children, and people who'd recently lost favor but hadn't yet been poisoned. Meanwhile, the host sat in a position to see everyone, equal parts gracious entertainer and paranoid emperor, because a Roman feast wasn't just food, it was a social battlefield, and seating was strategic warfare with pillows. Once you found your spot, the real fun began. Roman table manners were less about hygiene and more about flair. Burping wasn't rude, it was a compliment to the chef. Slurping loudly? Totally acceptable. Eating with your hands? Expected. The lack of cutlery meant fingers did all the work. From picking up bits of roasted hare to scooping up garum-soaked lentils, the only utensil you might encounter was a cochlea, a small spoon with a needle-like end. One side for scooping, the other for stabbing things like snails, eggs, or uncooperative grapes. To keep things tidy-ish, elite diners used ivory toothpicks and linen napkins called mappe, which were often brought from home like some sort of fancy fabric flex. The rich didn't just want to dine well, they wanted to look good while gnawing on a stuffed dormouse. They perfumed themselves before arrival, dabbed their hands in rose water between courses, and might even be spritzed by a servant mid-meal. That's right, aromatic refreshers between bites of roast boar, because nothing pairs with animal fat like a cloud of lavender mist. But don't let the scented oils fool you. Hygiene was, let's say, creative. Romans weren't exactly germaphobes. Finger bowls were a thing, sure, but soap? Not really. Hands might be wiped on napkins or the nearest servant. And if you needed to relieve yourself during a 6-hour feast, because yes, banquets often went on forever, you could discreetly excuse yourself to use the facilities, or in some rowdier houses, there were portable chamber pots nearby, the same ones sometimes used by guests who didn't excuse themselves. Imagine trying to enjoy your honeyed pears while someone is conducting business 2 couches over. That's ancient hospitality. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, an army of slaves kept things running. They didn't eat, they didn't sit, they hovered, poured wine, cleared plates, and occasionally risked life and limb retrieving food, dropped under the table, which happened often, because balancing a full roast duck while lying on your elbow is harder than it looks. Some were taster slaves, others specialized in washing hands, managing perfumes, or even performing music while their masters dined. If a server dropped a dish or accidentally bumped a guest, it could mean a whipping, or worse. Being polite to slaves wasn't expected, being invisible was. And don't forget the entertainment. While eating, you might be expected to listen to a dramatic reading, recite poetry, or engage in philosophical debate, all while chewing. Not contributing made you seem dull. Contributing too much made you seem pretentious. The sweet spot was charming, but not insufferable. Difficult to achieve when your mouth is full of garum-drizzled turnips, and your seatmate is quoting Seneca between burps. Women. if they were even invited, had to navigate all of this without reclining. That's right, elite Roman women sat upright, while the men sprawled around like sleepy panthers on satin. Women were expected to be modest, quiet, and somehow glamorous despite the wine fountains and goat meat. They also had to dodge scandal. Reclining, especially with unrelated men, was considered suggestive. So while the men juggled snails and philosophy, women got a front row seat to the world's weirdest dinner theatre, and the food itself? Not always cooperative. Roman cuisine was oily, rich, and frequently slippery. With no forks to assist, dropping food was a regular occurrence. Guests developed all sorts of elegant techniques for retrieving fallen morsels. The fingertip pinch, the scoop and swish, or the classic accidentally kick it under someone else's couch and pretend it never happened. There were also rules about how to drink. Sipping too slowly made you seem stingy. Drinking too fast made you look unrefined. Toasting was an art form, and failing to participate marked you as a buzzkill, or worse, a Greek. You had to match the host's energy, keep up with the drinking rounds, and avoid passing out before dessert, or at least pass out in a graceful toga-preserving position. In sum, Roman table manners were a high-stakes balancing act, literally and socially. The forks hadn't been invented yet, but social anxiety had, and it came with honeyed snails. Every meal was a performance, every couch a status symbol, and every guest one dropped olive away from becoming dinner gossip for the next 2 decades. In ancient Rome, food wasn't just food. It was symbolism, strategy, and occasionally a power move that involved stuffing an entire animal inside another animal and lighting it on fire. Roman banquets were more than just a social affair. They were edible politics, carefully choreographed performances designed to impress friends, silence enemies, and remind everyone exactly how rich, powerful, or utterly unhinged you were. Because when you're trying to win over a senator, pass a law, or take over the empire, nothing says "vote for me" like a 4-day feast featuring peacock tongues and jugglers on stilts. Let's start with the basics. In a world without campaign ads, press conferences, or awkward handshakes at baby-kissing events, banquets were your PR machine. Throwing a lavish feast showed you had wealth, taste, connections, and enough economic sway to feed 100 people imported shellfish without going bankrupt. Hosting a dinner was essentially running for office with roast swan and bottomless wine, because in Rome, generosity wasn't just admired, it was expected. Which brings us to the grandmasters of overeating, the emperors. Nero, of burning the city while fiddling fame, used feasts the way modern leaders use social media to control the narrative, distract the masses, and flex so hard it echoed across continents. Nero's banquets were extravaganzas. He built a rotating dining room that moved with the sun so guests could always enjoy natural lighting and probably not notice they were being subtly hypnotized by excessive garum. Then there was Vitellius, a man whose stomach was as ambitious as his political career. He was famous for his Shield of Minerva feast, which included 2,000 fish and 7,000 birds, allegedly consumed in one sitting by the guests, not just him, though with Vitellius you could never be sure. These weren't just culinary curiosities, they were territorial statements, meant to show that the empire was so vast, so wealthy, that it could literally be served on a platter. When you eat a flamingo, you're not just being decadent, you're saying, "I control the flamingos now." But the use of dinner as political theatre didn't start with emperors. Even in the Republic, politicians hosted lavish public meals, sometimes called epula publica, for the lower classes, as a way to curry favor. Bread and circuses? Sure. But add a roasted pig and some free wine and suddenly you're consul for life. Roman law technically tried to curb this. Sumptuary laws limited how much you could spend on feasts, but enforcement was, let's say, selective. If you were powerful enough to throw a 5-course illegal banquet, you were probably also powerful enough to get away with it. And don't think the food was just for show. Every dish meant something. A whole roasted boar with its mouth stuffed full of sausages? That's not just dinner. That's imperial flexing, telling your guests you can afford meat upon meat. Exotic fruits from the east? A reminder that you have trading connections. A single grape delivered in winter? Absolute power move. The message, while you peasants are choking down barley gruel, I'm eating sunshine from Alexandria. Guests weren't just fed, they were judged. Who got invited, where they reclined, what dish was placed before them. It was all calculated social choreography. If you were seated near the host, you were in. If your meat was a little less roasted, or your wine came in a plain cup, check your standing. And if you got served last, start planning your career as a grain merchant. Of course, not all dinners ended in policy proposals and polite applause. Sometimes, banquets were power traps, a chance to isolate a rival, make them drunk, gather intel, or even publicly humiliate them. Cicero once accused Mark Antony of overindulgence, suggesting he hosted dinners that turned into disgraceful orgies of slurred speeches and spilled sauces. In Roman politics, what you ate could be turned against you. Oh, you think he's fit to govern? He once passed out into a goose while arguing about tax reform. And that's the thing. Roman dinner was never just about sustenance. It was messaging. Every course, every goblet, every belch was a line in a play. You weren't just feeding people, you were performing prosperity. Even long after the empire faded, this legacy lived on. Medieval feasts, royal banquets, French court cuisine, all owe something to the Roman model of food as theatre, as diplomacy, as manipulation. Modern state dinners, complete with photo ops and symbolic dishes, are just Rome with better silverware and fewer flamingos. So when we say Rome didn't do dinner, we mean it. Rome orchestrated dinner. It was edible propaganda, layered in sauces, served on gold, and seasoned with ulterior motives. A Roman feast could bankrupt a small province, secure an election, launch an alliance, or end a career. It could also unalive you if your host had ambitions and access to mushrooms. In the end, the Roman banquet wasn't just a meal, it was the ultimate weapon, and if you were lucky, you left full. If you were really lucky, you left alive. Let's talk about the world's strangest schools throughout history. Our childhood. The golden years of toys, snacks, nap time, and combat training in your underpants. Welcome to Sparta, where the only acceptable extracurricular was surviving, and your first school uniform was a single cloak and a whole lot of attitude. Starting at the tender age of 7, Spartan boys were torn from their weeping mothers, who were also terrifying by the way, and dropped into the agoge, a state-sponsored program with all the warmth and tenderness of a cactus. Think of it as military preschool, if the curriculum included beatings, cheese theft, and bear wrestling metaphors. The agoge didn't believe in cluttering young minds with distractions like math or joy. Instead, boys were taught physical endurance, weapon handling, battle formations, and the ancient art of not crying when punched in the ribs by your roommate. Your average school day included running barefoot over rocks to toughen the soles, group wrestling that looks suspiciously like a bar fight, learning to steal food from local markets, not because theft was encouraged, but because getting caught was the real failure. You see, the Spartans admired cleverness, but they downright worshipped sneakiness. If you successfully swiped a loaf of bread, you were resourceful. If you got busted, you clearly needed more beatings. This is the kind of logic that happens when your national identity is built on abs and anxiety. Education in reading and writing? Technically optional. Some boys learned basic literacy, but only enough to read orders or engrave their name on a tombstone. You know, the essentials. There was no point in studying philosophy when you were expected to die before 30 or retire into a beardy old war mentor. That's not to say they lacked values. The agoge instilled a rigid code: discipline, obedience, bravery, silence, and an almost religious commitment to not being soft. Speaking too much was frowned upon, which explains why Spartans were famous for their laconic wit, short, dry, and terrifying just like them. Example: enemy, surrender your weapons, Spartan, come and take them, mic drop, sword draw. Once you were toughened up, it was time for Sparta's version of final exams, the cheese altar ritual, also known as run at cheese, get whipped for it. Here's how it worked. A bunch of older teens armed with whips formed a line in front of a cheese altar. Younger boys would sprint toward the altar, trying to snatch the cheese. Meanwhile, the older kids beat the tar out of them. Why? Because cheese is a metaphor, apparently. This wasn't about snacks. This was about bravery, endurance, and how many lashes you could take before collapsing in agony with dairy in hand. Bonus points if you didn't scream. It wasn't unusual for a boy to die during this ceremony, but hey, what better way to honor the gods than with lactose and blunt force trauma? In the agoge, tears were for the weak, feelings were suspicious, and complaining was treated like treason. The ultimate goal was to create men who could withstand pain, deprivation, fear, and emotional complexity without blinking. Lost a tooth? Don't cry. Got frostbite? Suck it up. Just watched your friend get tackled by a goat? Silence, please. Grief is inefficient. Even mothers enforce this code. A Spartan mum famously told her son, "Come back with your shield or on it." Translation: win or die trying. And don't you dare embarrass the family with survival if it involves surrender. Sleeping arrangements. Spartan boys bedded down in shared barracks. On piles of reeds they cut themselves from nearby swamps. You couldn't bring a pillow, but you could bring lice. If you were cold, good. That meant you were learning. If you were hungry, great. That meant your survival instincts were sharpening. And yes, older boys were often encouraged to mentor younger boys in ways that ranged from stern guidance to ancient Greek awkwardness. Let's just say the agoge had its problems beyond cheese theft. Graduation from the agoge didn't involve a cap and gown. It involved a spear, a shield, and the haunting realization that you are now a full-time instrument of war. Congratulations, you survived school by becoming too angry to die. By 20, you became a member of the Spartan military brotherhood, expected to fight, march, and occasionally eat something not stolen. Civilian life wasn't an option until much later. Your full-time job was being terrifying. So next time you complain about math homework or cafeteria meatloaf, just remember, somewhere in ancient Greece a child was getting whipped for a piece of cheese, and he wasn't even allowed to cry about it. Imagine locking yourself in a tiny stone cell for 3 days, armed with a brush, ink, and your entire family's expectations looming over your shoulder like a very disappointed ghost. Welcome to the imperial examination system of ancient China, where academic pressure didn't just make you cry, it made you hallucinate, Confucius whispering passive-aggressive feedback into your ear. This was no ordinary test. The Keiju, as it was known, wasn't about finding the best student. It was about discovering the one human being capable of memorizing thousands of pages of Confucian philosophy, reproducing it word for word, and then writing an essay so flawless it made your examiner weep into his beard. And yes, it could take a lifetime to pass. Literally. Some candidates started as teenagers and still failed in their 50s. And if that doesn't make your final exams look like a pillow fight, nothing will. These weren't held in cozy libraries with ergonomic chairs. Oh no. Each candidate was assigned a testing cell, a charming concrete closet roughly the size of a coffin, with a plank for a desk, a bucket for everything else, and nothing resembling comfort or dignity. Once the test began, you were in that booth for up to 72 hours straight. No talking, no leaving, no cheating, and no fainting from existential dread. The bucket was your bathroom, bed, and best friend, and if you died from exhaustion or stress, they'd just quietly remove your body and slide the door shut for the next contestant. Next, what did you have to actually do in there besides slowly go mad? First, you had to memorize the 4 books and 5 classics, which combined make War and Peace look like a tweet. We're talking about a literary Everest of Confucian philosophy, historical records, ritual instructions, and moral guidelines that could fill a small library or one large panic attack. The goal wasn't just to understand the ideas. No, you had to quote them perfectly, interpret their meaning in ways that didn't offend anyone, and write essays so elegant they'd make the ancestors clap. And let's talk about those essays. You couldn't just write "I think taxes should be lower" and call it a day. No, each essay followed an insanely rigid format called the 8-legged essay, because apparently a normal number of legs wasn't stressful enough. Every part had to follow exact structural rules: opening, amplification, preliminary exposition, initial argument, central argument, latter argument, final argument, and conclusion. If that sounds like academic origami, it was. One wrong leg, and your future was over before your ink even dried. The pressure to succeed wasn't just academic, it was social, economic, and emotional. Passing the exams meant guaranteed entry into the bureaucracy, which in imperial China meant power, wealth, and prestige. You went from guy in village to guy with silk robes and people bowing at him in the village. It was the golden ticket, the ancient lottery, the only way out of a lifetime of backbreaking farm labor. And because these exams were technically open to any male, even the poorest peasant could theoretically rise to the top, as long as he had the time, money, connections, and mental stamina of a caffeinated owl. Which brings us to the elephant in the examination hall: failure. Most people didn't pass. Not on the first try, not on the 5th, and sometimes not even on the 15th. That's because the pass rate hovered around a soul-crushing 1–2%, depending on the dynasty. The rest went home empty-handed, often after decades of study, where they were expected to start over, because family honor doesn't care that your right hand no longer works from calligraphy-induced carpal tunnel. Naturally, this led to some colorful consequences. Some test takers cheated using hidden scrolls, secret ink, or shirts embroidered with answers. One legend tells of a man who memorized entire texts backwards so he could write them in reverse if caught. Others just lost their minds entirely, either from the isolation or from living in a culture that treated exams like a blood sport with metaphors. And then there were the parents. Oh, the parents. If you think modern families are a little intense about getting into good colleges, picture a dad in the Tang dynasty saying, "If you don't pass this year, your grandfather's ghost will haunt us until the dynasty collapses." The pressure wasn't just generational, it was ancestral. Failing meant dishonoring your lineage. Passing meant elevating your entire family's social status. So while your future was at stake, so was grandma's ability to get a better seat at the next ancestor banquet. If you somehow survived this gauntlet and passed, you were celebrated, paraded through your village, and immediately assigned a cushy government post where you got to write poetry, pass laws, and sip tea while everyone else aged in rice paddies. If you failed, you could try again, and again, and again, until you either passed or your family ran out of incense and patience. So the next time someone complains about modern exams being too stressful, remind them that at least you didn't have to hold in a pee for 3 days while writing Confucian essays in a concrete shoebox. Imperial China didn't do standardized tests. It did spiritual boss fights with calligraphy and humiliation. Welcome to medieval monastic school, where the day starts with prayer, ends with prayer, and in between is mostly just more prayer. If you were a boy lucky, or unlucky enough to be sent to a monastery for education, congratulations. You had just enrolled in the most spiritually uplifting, mentally draining, and aesthetically candlelit education Europe had to offer. Unlike the world of Spartan brawling or Chinese essay dungeons, monastic schools were not designed to produce warriors or bureaucrats. No, their goal was far more ambitious: to mold you into a God-fearing, Latin-spouting, ink-stained human printing press. Forget about recess. The only games here involved grammatical declensions and seeing how long you could stay awake during a 2-hour psalm recital. Let's set the scene. It's the 10th century. Your shoes are made of something that might once have been a goat. You've just been handed a quill, a sheet of parchment that costs more than your village, and a stern look from Brother Gregor, who smells vaguely of beeswax and judgment. He does not appreciate sighing, slouching, or blinking too loudly. His eyebrows can detect heresy from across the scriptorium. The curriculum was focused. By focused we mean painfully narrow. You learned Latin grammar, not because you were going to Rome, but because Latin was the language of the Church, and therefore of God, the Bible, and all official documents. Whether you liked it or not, your education was going to be one long relationship with the ablative absolute. Reading, writing, and copying religious texts filled your days, and memorization was the holy grail of learning. If you couldn't recite a passage from St. Augustine's Confessions while walking backwards barefoot through a cloister, were you even trying? Now you might ask, what about math or science? Surely the monks were also curious about the natural world, to which the answer is, kind of, but only if the natural world could be proven to glorify God in 6 steps or less. Astronomy was acceptable because it helped calculate the correct date for Easter. Arithmetic, permitted so you could count the days until Lent ended. But if you started asking questions like what is a cell, or why do birds exist, you were at risk of being smacked with a psalter and told to go copy Leviticus again. Speaking of smacking, discipline was the true cornerstone of monastic schooling. Silence wasn't just encouraged, it was practically weaponized. You spoke when spoken to, prayed when told, and did not, under any circumstances, yawn during scripture reading. If you did, Brother Gregor would glide across the stone floor like an avenging owl and assign you 10 extra lines of Latin and possibly a mild penance involving fasting, scrubbing the cloister steps, or contemplating your sins while standing barefoot on cold tiles. Monastic schools did not believe in leniency. They believed in the purifying power of repetition and sore knees. Classrooms were not exactly what you'd call ergonomic. Picture cold stone rooms, wooden benches with no backs, and ink so thick it doubled as glue if left too long. Heating was minimal to non-existent because suffering was character building, and you often wore your cloak indoors, huddled like a shivering burrito of righteousness. Light came from flickering candles, meaning that half your education happened under a permanent threat of fire and wax-related accidents. Fun fact: it was very common for students to get scolded for dripping candle wax on precious manuscripts, which were hand-copied and irreplaceable. The medieval equivalent of "you broke the school iPad" was "you smudged the Lord's Gospel with your filthy elbow." Despite the gloom, some boys thrived in this system. Those with sharp memories, neat handwriting, and a tolerance for spiritual guilt could rise through the ranks, eventually becoming monks, abbots, or even scholars respected throughout Europe. But even then, the life was one of routine. Wake before sunrise, pray, copy, chant, eat something grey, copy again, pray some more, sleep while cold, rinse, repeat, repent, and don't assume the food was a perk. Breakfast, if it came at all, was a chunk of dry bread and maybe a ladle of porridge with the flavour profile of disappointment. Meals were eaten in silence, accompanied by the soothing soundtrack of someone reading a sermon aloud. Yes, reading during meals was a thing, because if you were going to chew, it might as well be while contemplating the spiritual weight of Ezekiel. There was no school bell, just the monastic bell, which tolled to mark everything from the start of morning prayers to the exact moment your bottom should be on the chapel pew. Your life was ruled by time, but not your time. God's time, and God wanted you to study quietly, copy reverently, and never ever question why the ink froze in winter. So while monastic schools didn't have playgrounds or report cards, they did offer one consistent lesson: humility. You learned to be humble before God, before knowledge, and before the very real possibility of being assigned extra penance for smudging a capital D. Feudal Japan didn't mess around when it came to education, especially if you were born into the warrior class. For the sons of samurai, school was a little less colouring books and glue sticks, and a little more "here's a sword and here's a scroll. Welcome to Samurai Prep School," where the syllabus was equal parts martial arts, poetry, and existential dread. From the moment a young samurai could stand without wobbling, his life became one long crash course in Bushido, the way of the warrior. But don't let the cool name fool you. Bushido wasn't just about swinging swords and looking dramatic in the rain. It was a strict moral code that demanded absolute loyalty, calm under pressure, artistic refinement, and the ability to slice through an opponent and your emotions with a single stroke. A typical day in the life of a samurai student went something like this: wake up at dawn, bow to your ancestors, train in swordsmanship until your arms stopped working, recite Confucian moral lessons, perfect your calligraphy strokes, and wrap things up with either a tea ceremony or a round of archery. depending on whether the local sensei wanted you spiritually centered or just terrifyingly accurate. Lunch was optional, honor was not. The training was intense and unrelenting. Young boys learned the use of the katana, the iconic curved blade of the samurai, but also the wakizashi, a shorter companion sword, the yari, a spear, the naginata, a blade on a pole, and occasionally even the kusarigama, which was essentially a sickle on a chain and a strong argument for weapon safety classes. These weren't toys, they were tools of discipline, defense, and very stylish intimidation. But what truly set samurai education apart wasn't just the violence, it was the balance. Alongside martial arts, samurai children were expected to be masters of culture. This included the study of Chinese classics, Zen Buddhism, and poetry, particularly the compact and emotionally loaded form of the haiku. If you thought your school had high standards, consider this. Samurai were trained to calmly write about cherry blossoms and mortality in 17 syllables, moments before potentially going to war. Calligraphy, in particular, was considered a direct reflection of your soul. If your brushstrokes were wobbly or uninspired, what did that say about your inner discipline? A messy kanji wasn't just a bad grade, it was an existential crisis. One had to sit still, breathe evenly, and let the ink flow from the wrist as naturally as blood from a dishonored stomach. Too dark? Not for feudal Japan. And let's not forget the tea ceremony, which was somehow both incredibly peaceful and terrifyingly precise. The samurai version of home economics. It involved preparing and serving tea with such grace and mindfulness that any mistake felt like a spiritual crime. Every movement had purpose. The way you bowed, how you folded the cloth, the angle of the teacup. Samurai were expected to master this ritual to cultivate inner stillness and humility, while still knowing how to stab a man between the ribs without hesitation. This focus on self-mastery extended into Zen meditation, which wasn't just sitting in silence, it was a mental discipline boot camp. Samurai students practiced zazen, seated meditation, often for hours at a time, learning to still their thoughts and prepare for death without fear. Because in samurai education, death was not a hypothetical, it was an expected part of life. You were taught not just to fight and win, but to lose, gracefully, quietly, and with as much poetic flourish as humanly possible. Which brings us to the crown jewel of samurai school, the death poem. When faced with seppuku ritual suicide, usually by self-disembowelment, you were expected to compose a short poem beforehand, reflecting on impermanence, duty, and cherry blossoms. No pressure, just write a perfect haiku while kneeling with a short blade and the grim knowledge that your life was about to end, but your calligraphy better not smudge. Why all this? Because for the samurai, dying was an art, and living without honor was a greater failure than death itself. Samurai school was about more than just producing skilled warriors. It was about producing stoic philosophers with lethal wrists and perfect posture. You had to be equal parts monk, artist, and human buzzsaw. Graduation didn't come with a diploma. It came with the solemn recognition that you were now a fully formed instrument of duty, honor, and dramatic last words. If you got there, congratulations. If not, well, at least you had some decent haikus to show for it. The Victorian era, when dresses were bigger than doorways, emotions were suppressed like national scandals, and education for young ladies wasn't about solving equations, but about how to eat soup without accidentally ending your social career. Welcome to the finishing school, the ultimate boot camp for transforming awkward teenagers into porcelain figurines with just enough personality to nod gracefully and never startle a duke. The primary goal of a Victorian etiquette academy wasn't to educate in the traditional sense. No one was particularly interested in your ability to debate politics or calculate fractions. No, your job, particularly if you were a young woman of status, was to become accomplished. This vague term included a baffling combination of piano playing, needlework, conversational blandness, and the ability to sit for hours without slouching or developing thoughts of your own. Bonus points if you could faint delicately. Finishing school was a place where posture was not just encouraged, It was surgically enforced. Girls were taught to walk with books balanced on their heads, a method designed not just to promote good alignment, but to crush any rebellious spirit trying to sneak into their spines. If you stumbled, you didn't just lose the book, you lost your dignity, your potential suitor, and possibly your invitation to Lady Wexley's spring luncheon. A significant portion of the curriculum was dedicated to table manners, because nothing said unfit for marriage quite like using the wrong spoon. You had to master an elaborate cutlery choreography that rivaled military drills: forks for salad, forks for fish, forks for moral superiority. Elbows were public enemies, slurping soup was grounds for exile, and heaven help you if you reached across the table. Etiquette instructors were trained to notice even microscopic breaches in fork etiquette and respond with steely disapproval strong enough to curdle the cream. Conversation was another minefield. Girls were taught how to speak without saying much of anything at all. The ideal tone was light, pleasant, and absolutely non-confrontational. Topics like politics, religion, or opinions were firmly off limits. Instead, you discussed weather, poetry, or how absolutely charming Lady Farnsworth's drapes were this season. If you accidentally formed a strong opinion on anything, you were to quietly swallow it like a burnt crumpet and smile. Of course, communication wasn't limited to speaking. In Victorian etiquette academies, girls were also expected to become fluent in the secret language of fans. Yes, folding fans. These seemingly innocent accessories doubled as coded social tools. A flick to the left, I'm interested. A quick snap shut, back away slowly. Holding the fan over your left ear, let's elope. No, seriously. It was essentially flirty Morse code with lace and peacock feathers. And if you waved it the wrong way, you might accidentally propose marriage to the footman. But it didn't stop there. A truly accomplished young lady had to master a dizzying list of domestic arts, including embroidery, watercolors, flower arrangement, and piano performance. The point wasn't to express creativity. It was to prove you could sit still, follow instructions, and occupy your time quietly in a drawing room, without needing to be, interesting. Think of it as personality wallpaper. You were supposed to be lovely, soothing, and completely non-threatening to any man who might be browsing for a wife with decent ankles and an excellent stitch. The pressure to succeed at this genteel game of social survival was enormous. Finishing school wasn't just a finishing touch. It was often the defining step between becoming a duchess or a social cautionary tale. Girls were told in no uncertain terms that a single faux pas could torpedo their marriage prospects. Entering a room incorrectly, too fast, too slow, too enthusiastic, could be interpreted as poor breeding. Improper use of your gloves could suggest vulgarity. Laughing too loudly, that could land you in the dreaded category of trying too hard, which was basically a death sentence at tea. And just in case boys thought they were off the hook, etiquette schools didn't forget them. Young gentlemen were subjected to their own regime of posture, manners, and polite conversation. They learned how to bow correctly, offer an arm, and never speak unless absolutely necessary. Their job was to appear stoic, well-bred, and capable of reciting the correct number of duchesses at any given social event. Feelings? Also swallowed. Ideally with brandy. It's worth noting that all of this performative politeness was really about class signaling. Etiquette wasn't just about being polite. It was about proving you belonged to the upper crust, that you had been properly trained, groomed, and trimmed into the exact shape of societal perfection. And if you weren't, there was always spinsterhood. Or worse, the middle class. So the next time you wonder why people used to faint over nothing, or why Victorian novels take so long for anyone to declare their love, remember, they had to get through an obstacle course of rules, fans, forks, and unspoken rules about how to stand near curtains, and they did it all in corsets. In the grand tradition of miserable educational experiences, few can top the charm and subtle brutality of the colonial classroom. If you were a student in early America or Britain during the 17th or 18th century, your school day was less reading is magic and more please don't freeze to the bench while being shouted at about vowels. Welcome to the world of dunce caps, bird nesting, and the one-room schoolhouse from hell. where character was forged with ink-stained fingers and mild hypothermia. Let's start with the building itself, which was more rural toolshed than learning environment. These were one-room schoolhouses, often located in the middle of nowhere, heated by a single fireplace that worked only when it remembered to. Windows? Maybe. Insulation? Absolutely not. In winter, children sat shivering on backless wooden benches, clinging to the desperate hope that education would somehow be warmer in heaven. Desks were a luxury. If you were lucky, you got a wooden plank nailed to the wall. If you were unlucky, you got a lap and a deeply skeptical attitude about education. Pencils weren't yet standard, so students used quills and ink, which meant that any slight shiver could turn your spelling assignment into a Rorschach test. If the ink didn't freeze, your fingers probably did. And yet students came, often walking miles in every kind of weather, to sit in a freezing box and be taught by a teacher who was also the local enforcer, therapist, grammar tyrant, and possibly a failed minister. These teachers were typically underpaid, overworked, and armed with canes, switches, and the righteous fury of someone who definitely didn't want to be there either. Their job wasn't just to educate, it was to discipline, with gusto. Class sizes varied, but the attitude was the same. Learning must be earned through discomfort. Teachers expected obedience, silence, and immediate memorization. The curriculum was simple: the alphabet, spelling, Bible verses, penmanship, and enough moral instruction to ensure you would feel guilty until your next life. If you hesitated before answering, mispronounced a syllable, or looked too smug about long division, you were likely to meet the business end of a cane. One of the most memorable punishments was the infamous dunce cap, a tall, cone-shaped hat with the word dunce or a single giant D scrawled across it. The logic behind it was equal parts flawed and theatrical. Force the slowest or most confused child to sit in a corner wearing a humiliating wizard hat of failure, and somehow they'll learn faster. Spoiler alert, they did not. But they did learn to hate education with a white-hot intensity, and if the dunce cap wasn't sufficiently motivational, there was always bird nesting. This punishment involved tying a bundle of sticks, feathers, or twigs to a child's back to simulate a bird's nest. The child was then paraded around the classroom, or even outside the school, serving as a mobile cautionary tale about the dangers of poor penmanship or an off-color sneeze. It was the educational equivalent of a public stocks photo shoot, just add snow. Books were in short supply. Most students shared a single primer, usually the New England primer in the colonies, which was part ABC book, part religious indoctrination, and all gloom. Every letter was paired with a moral lesson. A is for Adam's fall, B is for the Bible true, C is for children crying in the cold because their teacher took their hat. Okay, we made that last one up, but it fits the vibe. If you were wealthy, you might own a personal horn book, a wooden paddle with a printed alphabet, protected by a sheet of transparent horn. If you weren't, you shared, squinted, and prayed. Lunch was often just as bleak. Students brought whatever they could from home: cold potatoes, bread crusts, or if they were lucky, an apple. There was no lunch break in the modern sense, just a pause in the emotional scarring to chew quietly before being herded back into grammar purgatory. But perhaps the most soul-stirring part of colonial schooling was its emphasis on fear-based learning. Mistakes weren't learning opportunities, they were failures to be punished swiftly and memorably. Forgetting your catechism, prepare for hand slaps, talking out of turn, say hello to a ruler wielded like a sword, looking at your friend and giggling, immediate exile to the corner with a sign around your neck that read idler. It was a system that believed in order, obedience, and trauma-based memory retention. And yet, in the middle of this storm of ice, ink, and indignity, learning did happen. Students emerged with a basic grasp of reading, writing, and how to fear God with impeccable spelling. Some even developed a lifelong love of books, possibly out of spite. And while the educational methods of the time now feel like rejected ideas from a Dickensian escape room, they laid the foundation, albeit on frostbitten feet, for broader access to learning. Welcome to ancient Egypt, land of pyramids, pharaohs, and intense wrist pain. While the rest of the world was still wondering what to do with rocks, Egypt had already developed a full-blown bureaucratic system that ran on one thing: scribes. These were the ancient equivalents of human printers, only less robotic, more stressed, and required to decipher a writing system that looked like a bird had run across wet cement. Becoming a scribe wasn't for the faint of heart or weak of forearm. It meant years of schooling, thousands of lines of copied texts, and a tolerance for symbols that included owls, baskets, seated men, and snakes, all of which meant entirely different things depending on context, location, and whether or not the gods were in a good mood. The ancient Egyptian writing system, hieroglyphics, contained hundreds of symbols, each with phonetic, semantic, or symbolic meanings. The phrase "memorize the alphabet" becomes a cruel joke when your alphabet has more animals than a zoo exhibit. So how did one end up as a hieroglyphic wizard with chronic back pain? It all started in temple schools, usually connected to major religious centers or government institutions. Only the sons of elite families, priests, administrators, and those wealthy enough to own sandals and spare linen were enrolled. Why? Because education was expensive, writing materials were precious, and the rest of the population was too busy hauling stones for eternity. From a young age, around 5 or 6, students began their training. It was long, it was harsh, and it was almost entirely spent copying things. A scribe student's daily schedule looked something like this: wake up at sunrise, greet the gods, and then spend the next 10 hours reproducing sacred hymns, tax records, and instruction manuals for how to embalm your uncle without cursing his soul forever. This was done on papyrus, the ancient precursor to paper, which was about as forgiving as a paper cut made from a cactus. No erasers, no whiteout. If you made a mistake, you rewrote the whole thing, or prayed no one noticed. Teachers, known as scribal masters, were not known for their warmth. They were sticklers for precision, form, and neatness, and they had zero tolerance for slackers. Ancient instructional texts actually warned students not to loaf, claiming that a scribe's success depended on constant repetition, humility, and the complete abandonment of sleep. One document from the era literally reads, "Be a scribe. It saves you from hard labor and spares you from carrying stones," which is true, but it left out the part about spending your life hunched over a desk like a socially anxious heron. Tools of the trade included a reed brush, a palette with 2 color cakes, black and red, and a jar of ink made from soot or crushed minerals. Students were often tasked with recopying moral proverbs and instructional guides, sometimes hundreds of times, all while seated cross-legged on stone floors that could turn your knees into hieroglyphs themselves. Imagine writing "Do not steal, for it is wrong" 60 times a day while contemplating stealing your way out of class. Despite all this, the goal was clear: become a full-fledged scribe, which, in ancient Egypt, meant joining the bureaucratic elite. Scribes weren't just writers, they were the record keepers of civilization. Every grain harvest, tax collection, religious ceremony, and military campaign passed through the hands of a scribe. They held power without wielding swords, and their work was respected if not celebrated by pharaohs and gods alike. Sure, their eyesight deteriorated by 30, and they probably saw birds in their sleep, but their job kept them out of the mines. A win, and make no mistake, there was competition. Younger scribes could and would replace older ones if they were faster, neater, or just remembered which cobra symbol meant blessed and not "please avenge my death." That's right. Scribe school had job insecurity before it was cool. If you fell behind, miscopied a spell, or started drawing your ducks too round, you could be demoted, dismissed, or sent to work on funerary art, which was less about writing and more about sanding stone for dead people who'd never say thank you. One ancient student, in a preserved letter, complains that his hand aches, his back is ruined, and his teacher is a lion in disguise. And yet he writes this imperfect script, with the kind of sarcasm only a truly talented scribe could deliver. That's the kind of dedication that earns you a desk in the afterlife. So next time you're tempted to complain about handwriting assignments or long days at the office, Consider the Egyptian scribe, bent over a sheet of expensive papyrus, dipping his reed pen into soot juice, trying to remember if the vulture symbol comes before or after the loaf of bread, while Brother Horemheb breathes down his neck. And all of this while knowing that somewhere a 9-year-old might be ready to take his place the moment he blinks. Before anyone was diagramming sentences, sharpening quills, or being publicly shamed for misusing a fork, there was an entirely different kind of classroom unfolding across the vast lands of North America. And this classroom had no walls, no desks, and definitely no pop quizzes. Welcome to the indigenous education systems of Native American nations, where knowledge wasn't written in books but carried in stories, sung through ceremonies, and demonstrated with a bow and arrow. This wasn't school in the way the Western world thought of it. There were no dusty chalkboards or dunce caps, and no teacher named something like Mrs. Thistlebottom glaring over half-moon spectacles. Instead, education was an immersive, lifelong process built into daily life, community, and survival. And the exams? Let's just say they involved things like tracking a deer across frozen terrain, or successfully preparing a fire-starting bundle without setting your eyebrows on fire. Pass-fail was very literal. At the core of many Native American educational traditions was oral storytelling, not just as entertainment, but as the primary vessel for knowledge. Elders were the wisdom keepers, the human libraries, passing down complex systems of science, history, law, spirituality, and ecological knowledge, in the form of stories so rich in detail that forgetting them wasn't just frowned upon. It meant you might actually miss out on how not to get eaten by a bear. These weren't casual bedtime tales. A single story could encode generations of observations, migration patterns, seasonal changes, herbal medicine, kinship responsibilities, and moral frameworks. And because the stories were told aloud, not written, learners had to develop world-class listening skills. No daydreaming. If you zoned out mid-story, you might miss the part about where the edible mushrooms grow, and wind up in a very psychedelic situation you did not sign up for. But don't imagine these lessons took place in some ceremonial classroom with a syllabus. Education happened everywhere while skinning a fish, planting maize, carving a canoe, or weaving baskets. Learning was integrated into real life, passed from parent to child, auntie to niece, grandfather to grandson. Want to master astronomy? Step outside and track the stars with your elder. Want to understand justice and responsibility? Participate in tribal councils and watch how decisions are made. No Latin exams, but a lot more existential relevance. Young boys and girls were both educated, often in gender-specific ways, but always with the goal of building competence and cultural identity. A child might learn how to trap animals without wasting resources, identify healing plants, or interpret animal behavior as a forecast of environmental shifts. This was STEM, if STEM stood for survival through every moment. Discipline wasn't enforced with rulers or pointy hats, but through community expectation and shame that hit deeper than any detention slip. You didn't just let yourself down if you slacked off, you let down your ancestors, your clan, and possibly your dinner plans. Try telling your grandmother that you forgot to gather firewood because you were feeling unmotivated. She'll motivate you with one glance and a tale about the time Coyote tricked a lazy raccoon into losing his tail. And what about assessments? Well, you either knew how to build a shelter, start a fire, and interpret the changing seasons, or you were cold, wet, and confused. There was no room for fake it till you make it. Mastery came through practice, observation, and repetition, and feedback was immediate. If you tied the wrong knot, your fishing net fell apart. If you didn't learn how to interpret a story correctly, you might misunderstand a taboo or sacred teaching, and that could have spiritual consequences far more unsettling than a failing grade. In contrast to European-style schooling, which prized written records, formal lectures, and tests, indigenous systems prized adaptability, memory, humility, and environmental awareness. You didn't get gold stars, you got competence, and competence was often a matter of life, death, or at least not embarrassing yourself in front of the entire village. Even the concept of time in learning was different. There was no school year, No report card deadlines. You learned when you were ready. You taught when you were respected. Knowledge wasn't something to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, lived, and passed on. Elders were revered not because they held diplomas, but because they remembered everything, including what happened 3 generations ago, what the land used to feel like, and which berries to avoid unless you wanted to hallucinate a conversation with a talking tree. And perhaps most brilliantly, storytelling was sticky. You don't forget a lesson when it comes wrapped in humor, myth, and the tale of a raven who outwits the moon. Western schools could have learned a thing or two from that, perhaps starting with how to make photosynthesis more entertaining than a brick. So while indigenous education didn't come with uniforms, rulers, or Latin declensions, it came with something arguably more valuable, an education tied to the earth, the people, the past, and the future, and one that required a sharp mind, sharper senses, and a really good memory for animal-based metaphors. Welcome to the glittering, angst-filled world of the Parisian art academies, where talent was everything, drama was inevitable, and if your charcoal smudges didn't scream, "I have suffered for my art," were you even trying? From the 17th to 19th centuries, the elite art schools of Paris weren't just places to learn how to paint. They were competitive pressure cookers, where reputations were born, broken, or tragically splattered across a ruined canvas at 3 a.m. These academies, particularly the legendary École des Beaux-Arts, trained France's top artists, sculptors and illustrators. But this wasn't your local watercolor club. This was a serious, state-sponsored institution with lofty goals to mold students into artistic instruments of national pride. You weren't there to doodle. You were there to create beauty, reflect glory, and maybe cry into your palette when your professor said your brushwork lacked emotional urgency. First, let's talk curriculum. It wasn't just painting and sculpture. Oh no, you studied anatomy, geometry, mythology, history, and architecture, because knowing how to draw a god meant understanding how his thigh muscles worked while he threw lightning bolts in perfect classical proportion. One cornerstone of your artistic education was the life drawing class, also known as drawing naked strangers with the intense focus of a surgeon. These classes were scandalous to outsiders and mortifying for students who didn't yet understand how to shade a kneecap convincingly. Nude models, both male and female, posed for hours under harsh light, while a semicircle of stressed-out students tried not to pass out from artistic anxiety. You were expected to capture not just the form but the spirit, the tilt of the hip, the angle of sorrow in the elbow. Got it wrong? Your instructor might call your sketch timid, the artistic equivalent of being slapped with a baguette. But the real battlefield was the salon, the ultimate art exhibition where students vied for immortality, or at least a decent review in the Paris Gazette. Each year, students competed in what was essentially the Hunger Games of oil painting, submitting massive dramatic canvases filled with weeping maidens, angry gods, or heroic generals pointing vaguely at distant battles. The stakes, recognition, career opportunities, and the chance to avoid spending your adult life painting ceilings in aristocrats' hunting lodges. At the heart of this was the Prix de Rome, a prestigious prize awarded to one young artist each year, granting them a scholarship to study in Rome. Winning meant fame, funding, and that your mother could finally stop saying, "But when will you get a real job?" Losing, however, meant social death, or worse, going home to paint portraits of horses for rich people who wanted their animals to look more heroic than they actually were. And the critiques? Oh, the critiques. Students endured brutally honest reviews from professors who had long since traded optimism for artistic cynicism. One misplaced shadow could trigger a 10-minute monologue on the tragedy of wasted brushstrokes. A weak color palette could lead to accusations of having no sense of divine composition. It was like Project Runway, but with more togas and fewer commercial breaks. Then there was the rivalry. Students sabotaged each other with whispered critiques, mysteriously misplaced brushes, and the occasional accidental spill of turpentine on a competitor's canvas. Your studio neighbor might compliment your rendering of an angel's foot, only to submit a nearly identical one to the salon the next week, with their foot just a little more radiant. But don't think it was all shade and sabotage. These academies also bred camaraderie. Artists stayed up late discussing aesthetic theory, romantic philosophy, and how many abs was too many on a Greek god. Friendships formed in the trenches of pigment and plaster, fueled by wine, baguettes, and shared emotional breakdowns. And drama? Oh, there was drama. This was 19th century Paris. You couldn't swing a paintbrush without hitting someone dramatically declaring that their soul was in agony because their marble bust of Athena looked too pedestrian. Artists adopted tragic haircuts. Some wore capes unironically. One might refuse to speak for a week because someone said their rendering of Apollo lacked moral tension. Yet beneath the ego storms and aesthetic meltdowns, the training worked. These academies produced some of the greatest artists of their time, many of whom redefined Western art. Their works shaped public taste, adorned palaces, and terrified critics. Even those who failed at the salon often went on to create masterpieces, after emotionally relocating to cafes where they muttered bitter things about the academy between absinthe sips. So, if you ever feel like your creative efforts aren't appreciated, just remember, someone once trained for 10 years to paint a perfectly muscular Zeus, only to be told his drapery was uninspired and his thunderbolt looked like a soggy baguette. Art school, where dreams go to weep, and also occasionally become immortal. Welcome to the elite boarding schools of the early 20th century, where the uniforms were itchy, the traditions were baffling, and the emotional growth was stunted, but the posture was exceptional. If you were unlucky rid wealthy enough to be sent to one of these schools between 1900 and the 1940s, your childhood likely consisted of cold showers, Latin declensions, and a near-religious obsession with rugby. Welcome to character building, Edwardian style, where every sniffle was a sign of weakness, and feelings were something you left behind with your teddy bear. These weren't just schools, they were institutions of correction disguised as education. Their stated purpose was to forge the next generation of gentlemen, leaders and men who could button a waistcoat in under 5 seconds, but in practice these boarding schools functioned more like military light correctional camps, with a thin coat of algebra on top. The day began, always, with a bell loud enough to wake the neighboring county. Students rose at dawn for a regimented routine that made prison look leisurely. First on the schedule, cold showers. Not lukewarm, not refreshingly brisk, glacial. The thinking went that discomfort made you a man, or at the very least, taught you how to scream quietly into your flannel. Then came uniform inspection, because God forbid your socks were askew. Shoes had to be shined, hair parted with mathematical precision, and collars stiff enough to slice bread. Teachers, or masters as they were ominously called, conducted these inspections with the kind of scrutiny typically reserved for forensic investigations. A wrinkled shirt could lead to a demerit. Too many demerits and you'd find yourself writing lines until your hand turned into a claw or scrubbing the floor with a toothbrush so wooden it gave you splinters in your soul. But if the dress code didn't destroy your spirit, the traditions might. Chief among them, fagging. Yes, that was the term. And no, it was not fun. Fagging involved younger students, the fags, acting as unpaid servants for older boys. Duties included polishing shoes, preparing baths, running errands, and generally enduring mild to moderate humiliation in the name of building respect and responsibility. In reality, it was a structured hierarchy of awkward child servitude, where the phrase "I exist to butter your toast" was not metaphorical. Of course, all of this occurred under the watchful eyes of teachers who were less interested in pedagogy and more in discipline. Academic learning took a backseat to ensuring that students could conjugate Latin verbs while being caned. Yes, caning, the preferred method of behavior correction. The offending student would be bent over a desk while a master delivered swift, painful whacks with a long, flexible stick. There were rules, of course, no more than 6 strokes. But let's be honest, after the 3rd one, you weren't really counting anymore. And then there was sport, which was less about exercise and more about ritualized suffering in short pants. Chief among these was cross-country running, a baffling obsession among boarding schools. For reasons no one fully understood, students were expected to run miles across muddy fields, through freezing rain, often uphill and occasionally, while still digesting breakfast porridge. It wasn't for fitness, it was for grit, that magical quality that supposedly turns small boys into future admirals, politicians, and emotionally unavailable fathers. Still, despite the emotional frostbite, students were expected to maintain a stiff upper lip and a lower lip that didn't speak out of turn. Crying was social suicide, complaining was beneath contempt, and expressing affection, absolutely not. You could, however, bond through sullen silence, shared trauma, and sarcastic remarks during cricket. Friendships were forged over bruised knuckles, lost mittens, and conspiratorial looks during chapel services that lasted longer than some careers. Meals were another battleground. You lined up for overboiled vegetables, grey meat, and something that might have once been pudding. You ate in silence, unless you wanted a speech about table manners and the dangers of modern softness. Seconds were rare, dessert was a rumor, and good luck if you dropped your spoon. Some schools treated that like a declaration of war. Despite, or maybe because of all this, these institutions produced generations of well-spoken, emotionally complex, and sometimes highly repressed adults. Many of Britain's prime ministers, judges, generals, and aristocrats passed through these chilly halls and claimed they were better for it, which is an interesting way of saying, I learnt to tie a Windsor knot while suppressing human emotion. These schools, for all their absurdity and borderline medieval practices, were deeply woven into the fabric of early 20th century elite society. They didn't just educate, they indoctrinated. The values they instilled, stoicism, obedience, superiority, and a mild addiction to Marmite, shaped nations. And while modern reforms have thankfully eliminated much of the worst excesses, the legacy remains. So next time you think your school was strict, remember, someone somewhere got up at 5 a.m., endured a freezing shower, ironed their own underpants, served toast to a smug 16-year-old, got caned for sneezing too loudly, and still had to run 6 miles through a bog before dinner. That's character building, or possibly character racing. And with that, our world tour of history's strangest schools comes to a close. From Spartan brawls to Parisian nudes, we've explored classrooms where survival, posture, ink stains, and social shame ruled the day. Education has never been just about knowledge. It's been about how you learn, why you learn, and in most cases what happens if you yawn at the wrong time. Let's say you're a respectable Sumerian in 3000 BCE. You've just finished a hearty dinner of barley bread and goat stew. Life is good, and suddenly, bam, one of your molars erupts in pain like it's trying to secede from the rest of your face. Do you go to the dentist? No, because that concept hasn't been invented yet. Instead, you go with the next best thing. Blame it on worms. Yes, toothworms, the ancient world's most ridiculous yet deeply committed scapegoats for toothaches. According to the Sumerians, if your tooth hurt, it wasn't because you had decay or infection. It was because a tiny demon worm had burrowed into your gum and was chewing away at your happiness from the inside out like a dental saboteur. And the worst part? This idea stuck around for thousands of years. That's right, people looked at dental pain and thought, obviously tiny evil worm with a grudge. This brilliant theory first appears on a Babylonian clay tablet, now stored in the British Museum. The incantation it contains is less medical advice and more the weirdest bedtime story ever. It goes like this. The worm crawls up from the underworld, whines to the gods that it's hungry, and is given permission to live in human teeth. There, it feasts on blood and gum tissue like it's a cursed buffet. The treatment recommended? Magical chanting. You are supposed to scare the worm away by yelling very specific poems at it. Because nothing says healthcare like aggressive poetry. These weren't just casual chants either. Sumerian and Akkadian priests who also doubled as healers, exorcists, and part-time meteorologists used a terrifying combination of incantations, smoke, and animal parts to drive the worm out. Imagine going in with a toothache and walking out reeking of burnt goat hair and regret, having had your mouth blessed by a man waving a bronze snake figurine. If you lived in ancient Mesopotamia and wanted something a bit more physical than chanting, you could try their version of a dental tool, a sharpened stick dipped in herbs and occasionally fire. Archaeological finds have revealed rudimentary picks and small bronze instruments, presumably used to scrape or stab your molar into submission. No anesthesia, no sterilization, and very little bedside manner. The best you could hope for was to pass out before someone decided to cauterize your gum with a heated arrowhead. Meanwhile, in ancient India, the medical text Sushruta Samhita offered far more technical advice. This early surgical manual, written in Sanskrit around 600 BCE, outlined procedures for cleaning, extracting, and treating teeth. Technically impressive, emotionally terrifying. One passage describes using forceps, shaped disturbingly like salad tongs, to yank out infected teeth. If you screamed, it meant the operation was going well. If you passed out, even better, less squirming. But let's not forget, in all of these cultures, medicine was deeply entangled with religion and mysticism. Your local healer might be a priest, a sorcerer, or both. The pain in your tooth wasn't just physical. It could mean your karma was out of balance, or you'd offended a god, or maybe your ancestors were haunting your bicuspids. So before anyone touched your mouth, there might be a quick chicken sacrifice, or at least a ceremonial chant asking the moon goddess to chill out. There are records from Egypt and Assyria of using opium and beer to dull the pain, which sounds great until you realize this wasn't modern medical sedation. It was here. Chug this and try not to scream while we dig around in your face with a fishbone. You might also have your face smeared with mashed garlic, goat fat, and crushed emeralds, which wouldn't help the toothache, but would guarantee that no one sat near you for the rest of the week. And through all of this, the toothworm theory persisted. It crept from culture to culture like, well, a worm. Ancient Chinese texts mentioned it. Early Arabic medicine acknowledged it. Even medieval European scholars centuries later wrote about ways to lure the worm out by placing foul-smelling herbs next to the aching tooth to coax it into leaving, like you were dealing with a picky renter, not an infection. It took the development of microscopes and actual science in the 17th century to finally debunk the worm myth. Until then, people continued to believe that their oral pain was caused not by cavities or bacteria, but by a mythological invisible squatter with a taste for gum tissue and dramatic exits. So the next time you wince from a toothache and reach for ibuprofen, take a moment to be grateful you're not being told to chant at a worm while someone waves incense at your face and prepares a red-hot copper pick. Because historically speaking, that was the premium dental plan. Let's set the scene. You're in ancient Egypt, around 1500 BCE. You've just finished munching on a delightful meal of barley bread, dried dates and honeyed goose, your version of dessert. Life is good, the Nile is shimmering, and you feel almost like a pharaoh. But then, your teeth start to ache. Not a cute little tingle, no, more like a full-blown sandstorm inside your mouth. And here's the kicker. You brushed your teeth this morning. Yes, despite their notoriously cursed tombs and mummification marathons, the ancient Egyptians were surprisingly into dental hygiene, but not in the relaxing, minty fresh way we know today. More like scrub your teeth with gravel and pray your gums hold up. Let's begin with the core problem: sand. Sand everywhere. Thanks to rudimentary grinding tools, most Egyptian bread was loaded with tiny bits of grit from the millstones. Combine that with a diet high in sugar-rich dates and honey, and you've got a recipe for catastrophic dental erosion. Imagine chewing a baguette filled with sandpaper 3 times a day forever. The result? Archaeologists studying mummies routinely find teeth worn down to the root, full of abscesses and jaws with more drama than an ancient soap opera. But the Egyptians were nothing if not inventive. In an attempt to fight back against their own culinary crimes, they developed what may be the world's first toothpaste, a delightful blend of powdered ox hooves, burnt eggshells, crushed rock salt and ashes. That's right, nothing says minty fresh like a mouthful of pulverized livestock and cremation residue. According to a 4th century papyrus, because of course they wrote this stuff down, the recipe was meant to clean the teeth, freshen the breath, and possibly exfoliate your soul. The mixture was rubbed directly onto the teeth with a finger or chewed like a powdery mint gone horribly wrong. The gritty texture probably did remove plaque along with enamel, gum tissue and any remaining will to live. And what about their version of mouthwash? Some records suggest rinsing with a mix of honey and beer, which, to be fair, sounds more like a frat party than dental care. Others used natron, a natural form of baking soda, and salt dissolved in water. Effective? Perhaps. Delicious? Debatable. Likely to cause screaming if it got into a cavity? Absolutely. Despite the tooth-breaking tools and recipes, Egyptians weren't just fumbling around with camel bones. They had actual dentists, or Swan W2, who specialized in oral care. These early practitioners weren't amateurs. They were trained, respected, and sometimes even worked directly for royalty. In fact, one of the earliest named dentists in history was Hesa-Ra, a royal court official around 2600 BCE, whose tomb proudly declared him chief of dentists and physicians. Imagine being buried for thousands of years and still having your dental credentials on record. Talk about job security. What did Hesa-Ra and his colleagues do all day? Other than probably give the world's most aggressive cleanings, they also attempted dental surgeries. Yes, that includes primitive fillings. Archaeologists have found mummies with teeth packed full of linen soaked in medicinal mixtures. Think of it as ancient gauze stuffed with whatever was lying around that smelled vaguely antiseptic. Some teeth even show evidence of being drilled, though how anyone stayed still for that without passing out or slapping the nearest priest is anyone's guess. Incredibly, Egyptian medical papyri contain detailed entries about treating toothaches, jaw infections, and gum disease. Many of these remedies involved not just materials, but also prayers and invocations, because when your only pain relief is a spell and a dab of crushed lotus root, you want all the divine help you can get. They even understood the connection between oral health and overall well-being. In some texts, dental issues were linked to digestive problems, headaches, and general malaise, fairly sophisticated thinking for a culture where embalming people was a Tuesday. And let's not forget the cosmetic angle. Egyptians valued appearance deeply, and clean white teeth were seen as a sign of beauty and status. You could have a pyramid-sized fortune, but if your smile looked like the edge of a worn-out chisel, people noticed. Still, we must acknowledge that their good intentions were sometimes wildly off the mark. Between the enamel-eroding toothpaste, sand in every bite diet, and deeply experimental filling materials, ancient Egyptians probably spent a lot of their lives in quiet, throbbing pain. Yet they soldiered on, smiling, chewing, and presumably avoiding dentists like we do today, just with fewer magazines in the waiting room and more jackal-headed gods carved into the wall. So the next time you roll your eyes at flossing, remember, your ancestors were scraping their teeth with burnt animal remains and hoping their molars didn't explode before they finished building a pyramid. Respect the past, brush with less hoof. The mighty Roman Empire, home of architectural marvels, epic togas, and surprisingly horrific dental hygiene. While the Romans built aqueducts, conquered continents, and basically invented central heating, their approach to oral care was a little less sophisticated. To put it delicately, if you had a toothache in ancient Rome, your treatment options ranged from mildly unsettling to prepare to scream into a mosaic. Let's start with the Greeks, who laid the philosophical groundwork for Roman medicine by embracing the theory of the four humours. According to this delightfully incorrect system, your health depended on the balance of black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Tooth pain. Clearly your biles were staging a coup. The cure, probably something like bloodletting, fasting, or being told to think happy thoughts until your molar calmed down. Spoiler, it didn't. By the time the Romans adopted this system, they had added their own twist, more vinegar, more superstition, and much more urine. Yes, urine. Human urine, to be exact, was used as a mouthwash. Why? Because it contains ammonia, which has disinfectant properties. Theoretically, it could kill bacteria. Realistically, it could also kill your social life. Roman writers casually recommended it as a whitening agent, meaning if you were trying to impress at the Colosseum, You might have just rinsed your mouth with what came out of someone else's chamber pot. If urine didn't do the trick, or if you had standards, there were other delightful options. Vinegar, mixed with crushed bones, oyster shells, or pumice, was used as a scrub. The result? Maybe slightly cleaner teeth, but also massive enamel erosion and gums that hated you. Your mouth wasn't so much refreshed as chemically exfoliated. Think of it as Roman Listerine. If Listerine had been designed by someone actively trying to sandpaper your teeth down, and when things went really wrong, say an abscess or a rotting molar, the Romans didn't shy away from surgery. Archaeological digs in Pompeii and other Roman sites have uncovered actual dental instruments, and they look like they belong in a medieval torture museum. There were forceps for tooth pulling, long metal picks for cleaning out decay, and terrifying drills powered by hand. Yes, hand drills. And no, you weren't unconscious. The best you got was a strong cup of wine, a rag to bite down on, and a friend yelling, "Be brave, Marcus," while someone cranked metal into your jaw. These dental tools were made of bronze or iron, which was both impressive and horrifying. One particular favorite was a long hooked device that could fish out decayed matter from a cavity, a sort of ancient floss, but worse in every conceivable way. Some even had adjustable jaw openers, designed to pry the mouth open while a dentist fished around inside. And by dentist, of course, we mean someone who may also have been a butcher, a barber, or just really enthusiastic about metalwork. So what did all this mean for your average Roman citizen, or even worse, a Roman soldier? Well, for starters, soldiers had atrocious dental health. Their rations consisted largely of hardtack, a type of stone-hard bread that could double as a weapon in emergencies. This, along with dried meats, wine, and zero concept of calcium supplements, meant their teeth were constantly under siege. Archaeological remains from Roman military graves show severe wear, abscesses, and tooth loss, often in men who hadn't even hit 40. Imagine marching across Gaul with half your teeth ground down to nubs and an infected jaw, and still being expected to stab a barbarian before sundown. Records suggest many soldiers died not from wounds in battle, but from infected gums and untreated dental infections that spread to the bloodstream. Dental pain wasn't just annoying, it was often deadly. To their credit, the Romans did value cleanliness. Public baths, clean water, and hygiene were major societal points of pride, but when it came to the inside of the mouth, they were flying blind, armed with vinegar, powdered animal bits, and the world's most unfortunate rinse and spit method. Still, Romans were big fans of aesthetics, and rotten teeth were considered unattractive, even in a world where indoor plumbing was exotic. Wealthier Romans might import fancier dental powders or hire physicians trained in Alexandria. These elite clients would enjoy a tooth cleaning while lounging on a marble couch and complaining about politics. But even with the best treatment available, their options were limited to abrasive powders and prayers that their molars held it together for one more feast. Ultimately, the Roman dental system was one of trial, error, and lots of wincing. They were ahead of their time in some ways, writing manuals, inventing tools, and taking hygiene seriously. But they were also working with no understanding of bacteria, infection, or why scraping your teeth with crushed bones might not be ideal. So if you think brushing twice a day is a hassle, remember, somewhere in history someone had to choose between rinsing with urine or having their tooth yanked out with a rusty bronze claw. You, dear reader, have a dentist who wears gloves. That's progress. Welcome to the Middle Ages, an era where you could wake up in a drafty stone hut, fight off a plague by lunchtime, and still have time to visit your neighborhood barber for a haircut and an impromptu dental surgery before dinner. Because in medieval Europe, your local barber wasn't just there to give you a fresh bowl cut, he was also your tooth yanker, bloodletter, and amateur facial reconstructive artist, all rolled into one. The title was barber surgeon, and it was exactly as terrifying as it sounds. These were the jacks of all trades of the medical world, licensed, barely trained, loosely and enthusiastic, questionably. If you had a molar that felt like it was trying to tunnel out of your jaw, you didn't go to a dentist, because that profession didn't really exist yet. You went to Larry the barber, who who would put down his scissors, roll up his sleeves, and start rooting around in your mouth like he was searching for treasure in a wet sock. And let's talk about anesthetic, or more accurately, the complete lack of it. In a world where the most advanced pain relief was drink this ale and scream into your sleeve, getting a tooth pulled was a full-body experience. If you were lucky, they gave you a stick to bite down on. If you were really lucky, they tied you to a chair first, so you didn't launch yourself through a stained glass window mid-yank. The tools of the trade were lovingly dubbed dental keys, and they looked like a sadistic version of a wine opener crossed with a door handle. The barber surgeon would jam the key into your mouth, hook it around the offending tooth, and twist violently until the tooth popped out, brought friends, or shattered into pieces, in which case congratulations, you're staying another night. There was often blood, there was sometimes fainting, and there was never, ever sterilization, which brings us to hygiene. The medieval approach to cleanliness was best described as optional at best. Tools were wiped on an apron, rinsed in a pail of water that might have doubled as a chamber pot, and then reused immediately. There was no concept of germs, the microscope hadn't been invented, and the idea that invisible death critters lived on your forceps was not yet on anyone's radar. If a patient died after a procedure, it wasn't due to sepsis. No, it was because they had sinned, or their bile was acting up again. Classic bile. In fact, the dominant medical theory of the time was still humorism, that your health depended on balancing the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So if your mouth was hurting, a barber surgeon might decide it wasn't the cracked, rotting molar embedded in your jawline, it was because you had too much blood. The solution? Bloodletting. Sometimes right there in the chair, while your half-extracted tooth jiggled freely like a loose chandelier. And they didn't stop there. Leeches were also a crowd favorite, applied directly to the gums or jaw to draw out the bad humors. If your face swelled up from an abscess, they'd slap a couple of those little guys right on your cheek and wait for the problem to balance itself. In reality, of course, you were now infected, bloody, and under attack by a worm with no concept of boundaries. But hey, the leech was probably having a good day if the pain persisted after the extraction. Or if the barber accidentally removed part of your jaw, which happened, there was always cauterization, a red-hot iron pressed directly to the socket, not to stop infection. They didn't know what that was, but to seal the pain inside. Yes, medieval logic held that by burning the nerve endings and closing the wound with molten metal, you were trapping the evil humors in place so they wouldn't float around your body, wreaking further havoc. Because nothing says healing like turning your gum line into a medieval campfire. And all of this was done in public. Barber surgeons often performed extractions in marketplaces, town squares, or just outside the shop, a live show for curious onlookers and potential customers. If the patient survived and didn't immediately pass out, that was great marketing. If they did pass out, well, at least it drew a crowd. Despite all this madness, barber surgeons were technically trained. They belonged to professional guilds, were recognized by the church, who loved a good bloodletting, and even carried licenses in some regions. But the knowledge was a hodgepodge of Roman hand-me-downs, religious rituals, and sheer guesswork. The job required a strong stomach, a firmer grip, and a tolerance for screaming that bordered on supernatural. So the next time your dentist apologizes for a slight pinch, remember that your medieval counterpart had a molar pulled with no warning, no numbing, and no dental floss, just a jug of ale, a rusty tool, and a man who also gave shaves on Tuesdays. Ah, the Enlightenment, a time of powdered wigs, candlelit salons, and the birth of modern science. Humanity was finally beginning to abandon the whole scream and cauterize method of medicine in favor of reason, experimentation, and actual books. But when it came to dentistry, let's just say the Enlightenment gave us a fancy coat of paint over a mouthful of nightmares. The good news, people were no longer blaming their toothaches on demonic worms. The bad news, they were now fixing them with corpse teeth, melted metal, and horse jawbones. Welcome to the 17th and 18th centuries, an era where progress met poor taste, and no one was more emblematic of this dental drama than George Washington. the man whose mouth deserves its own tragic biography. First, a little historical context. By the 1600s, dentistry was finally inching toward respectability. Europe was teeming with Enlightenment thinkers who insisted that health was not the result of divine punishment or bad vibes, but rather bodily systems that could be observed, understood, and ideally fixed. Medical schools popped up, scientific journals circulated, and in the world of teeth, the worm theory was finally buried in favor of decay-causing acids and plaque. But this newfound knowledge didn't exactly translate into comfort. Tooth extractions were still brutal, anesthetics still didn't exist, and if your teeth started failing, which they often did due to sugar-heavy diets, tobacco and zero fluoride, you faced a grim fork in the road. Suffer endlessly, or fake it till you make it with false teeth. Now let's talk about dentures. Forget your modern image of sleek porcelain and discreet adhesives. Enlightenment-era dentures were chunky, clunky nightmares crafted from materials that ranged from bad to haunted. Common options included ivory, from elephants, walruses, or hippos. Because when your jaw hurts, nothing helps like the taste of colonial overhunting. Metal, such as brass, which offered durability and a charming metallic taste of doom. And worst of all, human teeth. Yes, actual teeth pulled from the mouths of corpses, criminals, or most disturbingly enslaved people. Which brings us to the original founding father of dental misfortune, George Washington. By the time he became president, Washington had only one tooth left. Just one. The rest had been sacrificed to abscesses, ill-advised dental treatments, and possibly years of gnawing through diplomatic stress. Over his lifetime, he owned multiple sets of dentures, each more horrifying than the last. Contrary to the popular myth, his dentures were not made of wood. That story likely originated from the fact that ivory, over time, becomes stained and grainy, especially when soaked in wine and despair. In truth, his dentures were a Frankenstein's buffet of materials: hippopotamus ivory, gold wires, springs, screws, and yes, teeth taken from enslaved people. Records from Mount Vernon even list payments to individuals for 9 teeth at a time. These teeth were then repurposed into presidential grins, which is perhaps the darkest twist in American oral history. Wearing these dentures was not a pleasant experience. They were bulky, ill-fitting, and required constant adjustment. Springs pushed the upper and lower jaws apart, meaning Washington often had to clench his mouth just to keep them in place, which is why many portraits show him with a tight-lipped, grim expression. The poor man wasn't stoic. He was just trying not to let his jaw explode. Outside the presidential palace, the dental world was undergoing an awkward puberty. The Enlightenment gave rise to the first professional dentists, people like Pierre Fauchard, the father of modern dentistry, who wrote Le Chirurgien Dentiste in 1728. This groundbreaking text outlined everything from oral anatomy to dental surgery, and even the benefits of flossing. Yes, Enlightenment people flossed, though probably with a piece of violin string. Fauchard also helped kill off the barber-surgeon model, finally separating tooth care from haircuts and leech application. Dentistry was becoming a legitimate medical profession, complete with special tools, standardized procedures, and fewer open-air screams. Dentists even began designing early dental chairs, although calling them comfortable would be a legal overstatement. Of course, things weren't perfect. Hygiene was still inconsistent. Techniques were experimental at best, and your chances of infection remained sky-high. But for the first time, dentistry wasn't just about reacting to pain, it was about preventing it, or at least attempting to disguise the consequences. False teeth became fashion statements, and upper-class Europeans began commissioning custom sets to preserve their public image, even if their molars had long since surrendered. So yes, the Enlightenment gave us telescopes, physics, encyclopedias, and elite dentures made from the crushed dreams of enslaved labor and animal tusks. Progress, in its weird and often disturbing way, marched on. And the next time you see a dollar bill and marvel at George Washington's stern expression, just remember, behind that stoic face was a screaming set of ivory jaws held together with wire, gold, and other people's teeth. Welcome to the 19th century, a time when society was inventing railroads, writing novels about sad orphans, and brushing their teeth with poison. The Victorian era was a strange cocktail of scientific curiosity, poor regulation, and marketing chutzpah, which meant that every trip to the apothecary came with a side of danger. If you had dental problems in the 1800s, your options included arsenic, mercury, lead, and a generous sprinkle of cocaine, all sold over the counter, all applied directly to the gums. What could possibly go wrong? Let's begin with arsenic toothpaste, because nothing says refreshing minty breath like a substance that also kills rats. Victorian chemists, full of enthusiasm and wildly untested theories, believed that arsenic, in small doses, could brighten your teeth and fight off decay. They weren't entirely wrong. Arsenic is antimicrobial, but they were absolutely wrong about the part where it should go in your mouth. People rubbed it on their gums daily, sometimes mixing it with chalk or powdered coral. Side effects included ulcers, organ failure, and in extreme cases the sudden need for a coffin. But arsenic wasn't alone in the toxic dental care aisle. Lead made frequent appearances too. Lead acetate, charmingly known as sugar of lead, was used in some dental powders to give a sweet taste. That's right, Victorians sweetened their toothpaste with a neurotoxin. Lead is especially dangerous because it accumulates in the body, leading to symptoms like fatigue, abdominal pain, mood changes, and that ever-popular side effect, death. Then there's mercury, often used in early dental fillings and treatments for sore gums. Mercury was praised for its antibacterial properties, again technically true, but no one seemed too concerned that it was also vaporizing into their faces. Dentists would pack a mercury-based amalgam into your tooth and then casually tell you not to chew on anything too crunchy or have too many thoughts. Symptoms of mercury poisoning include tremors, memory loss, and hallucinations, which means Victorian dental patients were not only hurting, they were also seeing visions while their fillings glowed like something out of a gothic horror story. And if you thought kids were spared from all this chemical warfare, think again. Toothaches were common in children because sugar was everywhere and floss wasn't, so apothecaries offered soothing syrups and toothache drops. These miraculous elixirs were packed with cocaine, alcohol, and morphine. One popular brand was even labeled for teething infants. Imagine being 4 years old and getting dosed with pure Colombian confidence juice because your molar hurt. Now, if you were an adult with dental anxiety, the 19th century had something just for you: nitrous oxide, aka laughing gas. Discovered in the late 1700s but popularized in the 1800s, nitrous oxide was seen as a wonder drug, a way to dull the pain without putting patients into a full coma. Dentists would strap a massive hissing mask over your face, let you inhale the gas, and then begin yanking teeth while you giggled uncontrollably and occasionally tried to sing. Did it always work? No. Were patients sometimes underdosed or overdosed? Absolutely. But compared to having your tooth yanked with nothing but whiskey and a prayer, it was practically luxury. Of course, not all progress was terrifying. The Victorian period did see a genuine rise in personal dental hygiene, especially among the growing middle class. Toothbrushes became more widely available, often made with bone or ivory handles and boar bristles, because nothing screams clean like scrubbing your enamel with pig hair. They weren't cheap, but they were marketed heavily, with ads boasting about British superiority in oral neatness and showing genteel ladies smiling through what must have been truly painful cavities. Tooth powders became a staple of the Victorian bathroom cabinet, or chamber pot shelf, let's be honest. Recipes included things like charcoal, baking soda, and dried herbs. Some were relatively safe, while others were just powdered brick dust with lavender oil. And yes, many of them contained ingredients like alum to stop bleeding and ground glass to polish the teeth or destroy them, dealer's choice. As dentistry professionalized, dental manuals started to appear. Books like The Dentist's Monitor and Every Man His Own Dentist offered home remedies, diagrams of tooth structure, and enthusiastic encouragement to have the offending tooth removed forthwith. These guides were sometimes helpful, sometimes terrifying, and always weirdly obsessed with moral cleanliness. Having bad teeth was often seen as a sign of moral decay, a physical expression of laziness, gluttony, or poor character. So if your breath smelled bad, it wasn't just a hygiene issue, it was basically a spiritual failing. Meanwhile, dentistry was slowly clawing its way out of the shadows. Dental schools opened, scientific journals began publishing real research, and by the late 1800s, people were talking seriously about sterilization, hygiene, and preventive care. Sure, you could still buy arsenic paste if you knew the right chemist, but at least someone somewhere had started boiling the tools. So yes, the Victorian era gave us Dickens, steam trains, and Queen Victoria's impossibly large mourning wardrobe, but it also gave us lead-flavored toothpaste, cocaine for babies, and dental equipment that looked like medieval bear traps. It was a time of wonder, progress, and an absolutely staggering tolerance for pain and poor decisions.